He humiliated her at the family gala. Then everyone froze when the Mafia Don kissed her hand. She stood alone beneath a chandelier worth more than her father's entire life, champagne dripping at her feet while 400 of Chicago's most powerful people watched a man destroy her dignity one syllable at a time. She didn't flinch, she didn't cry. She held still the way prey holds still when it knows running means dying faster. Then the ballroom doors opened, and the most feared man in the city walked straight toward her, past senators, past billionaires, past the man who had just humiliated her, removed his glove, took her trembling hand, and kissed it. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, and everything in her life changed forever. If this story reaches you, hit like and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Stay until the end, because this one will break you. Chicago wore its winter the way old fighters wear scars. Not with pride exactly, but with the understanding that beauty and damage were the same currency spent differently. Rain came sideways off the lake that night, slashing through downtown streets and turning the skyline into something blurred and dishonest, all those billion-dollar towers dissolving into fog like the promises that built them. The Blackthorn Grand Hotel punched upward through the weather at the corner of Michigan and Superior, 62 floors of imported stone and architectural arrogance. On nights like this, with the wind screaming and the temperature dropping hard enough to kill the homeless sleeping beneath the L tracks 6 blocks south, the hotel glowed from inside like a furnace full of gold. The Valmont Foundation Gala occupied the entire top floor. Vivian Mercer arrived through the service entrance at 7:14 p.m. carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with donor files she'd spent 11 hours organizing. The freight elevator smelled like industrial cleaner and old grease. She pressed the button for 62 and watched the numbers climb while her reflection stared back from the brushed steel doors. A woman in a rented silver satin dress with circles under her eyes that no amount of borrowed concealer could fully erase. She was 29 years old. She looked 35. 3 years of grief will do that. 3 years of working a morning shift at a downtown accounting firm where her title was administrative coordinator, but her actual job was fetching coffee and correcting other people's decimal points, then crossing the city to work evenings and putting data for a medical billing company that operated out of a strip mall near Cicero. 3 years of eating rice and canned soup in a studio apartment whose radiator worked only when the building's plumbing didn't, which meant she was either warm or clean, but rarely both at the same time. 3 years since her father put a bottle of sleeping pills on his kitchen table, wrote a letter nobody ever found, and simply stopped being alive. The elevator opened. The ballroom hit her senses like a slap. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across a dance floor the color of frozen milk. An orchestra played something classical and forgettable near the west windows. Guests moved through the space in clusters, men in tuxedos that cost more than Vivian's annual rent, women in gowns that existed specifically to make other women feel poor. The air smelled like champagne, expensive cologne, and the particular brand of self-satisfaction that only old money produces. Vivian spotted Margaret Chen near the auction tables and moved quickly along the perimeter, keeping her head low and her steps efficient. Margaret ran the Foundation's donor relations office and was the reason Vivian was here tonight. A favor, a simple errand, deliver the files, smile, disappear. "You're late," Margaret said without looking up from her tablet. "The L was delayed." "The what?" "The train, Margaret." Margaret glanced at her with the particular expression that people who drove BMWs reserved for people who rode public transit. "Well, the files?" Vivian handed over the portfolio. Margaret opened it, flipped through 3 pages, and nodded once. "Fine. You can go." But Vivian didn't go. She stood at the edge of the ballroom and watched the world that used to be hers move without her, the way a ghost watches the living through windows it can no longer open. She recognized faces. Senator Arthur Valmont near the bar, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, performing statesman charm for a circle of donors who laughed on cue. Federal Judge Patricia Holloway by the orchestra, nursing gin and pretending she wasn't scanning the room for threats. Real estate developers, media executives, hedge fund managers, city aldermen whose campaign finance reports read like crime fiction. She knew these people. Or rather, she had known them once, when her last name still carried weight, when her father still walked through rooms like this with his hand on her shoulder and his voice full of the quiet authority that came from being genuinely good at what he did. Raymond Mercer, forensic accountant. The man who could read a balance sheet the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, finding tumors hiding in the numbers, cancers growing between the columns, until they killed him for it. Not with bullets. Nothing that merciful. They killed him with paper, fabricated evidence, forged documents, anonymous tips to the SEC. A coordinated campaign of financial slaughter so precise and so complete that within 90 days, Raymond Mercer went from respected professional to accused criminal, from comfortable home to frozen assets, from dignity to destruction. He died alone in a rented room in Bridgeport with nothing left but the sleeping pills and whatever was written on that letter nobody ever found. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, brought on by an accidental overdose. Vivian knew better. Shame was the weapon. Shame was what killed him. The slow, methodical application of humiliation until a proud man decided death was less painful than one more morning of being alive and ruined. She thought about this while she stood at the edge of the Valmont Foundation Gala, invisible and furious, watching the people who had done it celebrate themselves under crystal light. Then Harrison saw her. She felt him before she heard him, that specific disruption in the room's social gravity that happened whenever Harrison Valmont decided to move. People shifted. Conversations adjusted. Eyes tracked him the way smaller animals track predators crossing open ground. He was 32, tall, athletic in the manufactured way that came from personal trainers and protein shakes rather than actual labor. His face belonged on campaign posters, which was exactly where it was headed. Perfect jaw, perfect teeth, eyes that looked warm from a distance and turned flat and predatory up close, like a lake that seems blue until you're drowning in it and realize it's just gray. He crossed the ballroom holding a champagne flute, and Vivian's stomach dropped the way it always did. Not from attraction anymore, but from the specific nausea of remembering who she used to be when she loved him. "Well," Harrison said, and his voice carried deliberately, pitched for performance rather than conversation, "Look who finally found her way back into high society." Conversations within a 15-foot radius slowed. Heads turned with the practiced subtlety of people who spent their entire lives pretending they weren't watching. Vivian straightened her spine. The dress suddenly felt cheap. The borrowed shoes pinched her toes. "Good evening, Harrison." He circled her, slowly. The way he used to circle opponents in Princeton debate tournaments, not looking for weakness but displaying his certainty that weakness was everywhere and he'd already found it. "I heard you were working downtown now." His smile widened. "Accounting assistant? Data entry? Something small, I'm sure." Several guests laughed. Not loudly, just enough to confirm that cruelty was still socially acceptable when wielded by the right last name. Vivian's jaw tightened until her molars ached. She had loved this man. Genuinely, desperately, stupidly loved him during her father's last year of freedom, when the Mercers and the Valmonts still existed in the same social stratosphere. Harrison had been charming then, attentive. He brought her flowers that probably cost less than his bar tabs, but felt expensive because of the way he presented them, with that half grin and the eye contact that made you feel like the only person in any room. He told her he loved her on a Tuesday night in October while they sat on the roof of his family's Lincoln Park townhouse, drinking wine that cost more than her car payment. He told her he wanted to marry her. He told her they'd build something together. 6 weeks later, the SEC investigation hit, and Harrison Valmont stopped returning her calls. Not gradually, not awkwardly, just stopped. Like she'd been deleted from a contact list he was constantly curating. When she finally reached him, desperate, crying, begging for help while her father's life collapsed, Harrison said 4 words that burned themselves permanently into her memory. "This isn't my problem." Now he stood in front of her at his family's gala, circling her like damage assessment after a storm he'd personally ordered. "You should have stayed gone, Vivian." He leaned closer. His breath smelled like expensive champagne and entitlement. "People like you make rooms like this uncomfortable." Her fingernails bit into her palms. Blood hammered behind her eyes. Every instinct told her to speak, to fight, to say the things she'd rehearsed alone in her apartment at 2 in the morning when rage replaced sleep. But she didn't, because she was outnumbered, outgunned, and smart enough to know that emotional combat against a man who owned the arena was just another form of losing. "I'm here to deliver files," she said quietly. "That's all." Harrison studied her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, because guilt required a conscience, but something adjacent. Irritation, maybe. The annoyance of a man who expected his cruelty to produce a satisfying response, and instead got composure. So he escalated. He took the champagne glass from her hand. Not aggressively. That was the worst part. He did it casually, the way you'd take a toy from a child, with absolute certainty that ownership was his to decide. Then he poured it slowly onto the marble floor at her feet. The ballroom went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The specific, devastating silence that happens when 400 people collectively decide to watch someone be destroyed and do nothing about it. Champagne pooled around Vivian's borrowed shoes. She felt it seep through the thin satin, cold against her toes. "Oops," Harrison said. His smirk was surgical. "Guess some things just don't belong here anymore." Vivian stood completely still. The humiliation wasn't in the champagne, it was in the silence. 400 people with the collective power to reshape nations, and not one of them spoke. Not one of them moved, because the Valmont name was worth more than a woman's dignity, and everyone in that room had done the math. She felt heat building behind her eyes. The dangerous kind. The kind that precedes either tears or violence, and she didn't know which was worse. She was 3 seconds from breaking. Then the main doors opened. Every security guard in the ballroom stiffened simultaneously. It was subtle. A shift in posture, hands moving toward earpieces, weight redistributing to the balls of their feet. The kind of coordinated response that only happens when a specific threat has been pre-identified, and everyone with a gun knows exactly who just walked in. A silence moved through the crowd before the man himself appeared. It traveled from the entrance toward the center of the ballroom like a pressure wave, conversations dying in sequence as the information spread person to person through glances and jaw tightens and the particular widening of eyes that accompanies genuine fear. Luca DeSantis entered the Valmont Foundation Gala at 8:47 p.m. He walked alone. No entourage, no bodyguards flanking his shoulders. Just a man in a dark tailored coat moving through a room full of people who suddenly remembered that civilization was thinner than they'd been pretending. Chicago knew who he was the way cities know earthquakes, not by seeing them, but by the damage patterns left behind. Luca DeSantis, 38. Born in West Harbor to a Sicilian family that had run dock operations for 3 generations. Educated at the University of Chicago, economics, never finished, before inheriting his father's organization at 24 after a car bomb on Ashland Avenue that killed both his parents and rearranged the city's criminal architecture overnight. They called him the Dawn of West Harbor in the newspapers that still had the spine to print his name. They called him the Ghost King on the streets, because people who became his enemies had a tendency to simply vanish. No bodies, no evidence, no noise, just absence where a person used to be. Judges feared him. Politicians obeyed him when cameras stopped rolling. Federal agents spent careers building cases that collapsed like sandcastles because witnesses developed amnesia or relocated to countries without extradition treaties. He was not the most violent man in Chicago's underworld. He was the most patient, and patience, in a city built on impulsive corruption, was the most terrifying weapon of all. Luca moved through the ballroom with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that speed was a symptom of anxiety, and anxiety was something he did not carry. His coat was dark gray, nearly black, Italian cut. Black leather gloves, hair pushed back, dark, slightly longer than fashion demanded. His face was angular and weathered in ways that suggested he'd spent time in rooms where the lights were bad, and the conversations were worse. His eyes were the problem. Dark brown, almost black, and absolutely still. They didn't scan the room nervously or perform the social calculations that every other person in the ballroom was running. They simply observed, cataloged, filed, and right now they were fixed on Vivian Mercer. Harrison noticed it first, His smirk began dissolving in real time, replaced by the slow, cold recognition that something was happening that he hadn't anticipated and couldn't control, a sensation Harrison Valmont had almost no experience with. "What the—" he started, but the sentence died in his throat because Luca DeSantis was walking directly toward them. Not toward the bar, not toward Senator Valmont, not toward any of the political allies or business contacts that a man of his position might reasonably approach at an event like this. Toward Vivian. The crowd parted without being asked. Nobody touched him. Nobody spoke to him. They simply moved, the way pedestrians step off the sidewalk when they sense something large and indifferent approaching. Luca stopped 2 feet in front of Vivian Mercer. Champagne still pooled around her shoes. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking. And Luca DeSantis, the most feared man in Chicago, looked at her the way a man looks at something he's decided to protect regardless of the cost. He removed one black leather glove. Slowly. Deliberately. With the careful precision of a man who understood that gestures in front of audiences were never casual. They were declarations. He took Vivian's right hand. Her fingers were trembling. His were perfectly still. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. The ballroom didn't gasp. Gasping would have required breath, and nobody in that room was breathing. 400 of Chicago's most powerful people stood frozen while the most dangerous man in the city performed an act of public reverence for the woman Harrison Valmont had just humiliated. Then Luca spoke. She should be treated with respect. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence was so complete that even the orchestra had stopped. His words carried the way thunder carries, not because of volume, but because of the atmospheric pressure behind it. He wasn't looking at Vivian when he said it. He was looking at Harrison. Harrison's face went through several shades of white. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The champagne glass he'd used as a weapon suddenly looked very small in his hand, and the hand holding it was trembling. Senator Valmont appeared at the edge of the circle, his political smile frozen in place like a mask someone had forgotten to remove. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, part restraint, part warning. "Mr. DeSantis," the senator said carefully, "this is unexpected." Luca turned his gaze toward the older man, measured him, made him wait. "Senator?" Just the word. Nothing more. Arthur Valmont's jaw tightened. He had spent 40 years building a career on the ability to control conversations, and in 3 seconds, Luca DeSantis had taken that ability from him completely. "Perhaps we should discuss—" "We have nothing to discuss tonight," Luca said. And then he turned back to Vivian. "Come with me," he said quietly. Not a command, not a request, something between the two that carried the weight of both. Vivian looked at him. She didn't know this man. She knew of him. Everyone in Chicago knew of him, but she had never spoken to him, never stood this close, never felt the specific gravitational pull of a person who operated outside every rule the rest of the world pretended to follow. Her rational mind screamed at her to refuse. Walking out of a gala on the arm of Luca DeSantis was the kind of decision that reshuffled your entire existence. It meant something, it communicated something, and whatever it communicated, there was no taking it back. But Vivian Mercer had been taking safe decisions for 3 years, and every single one of them had led here, standing in a puddle of champagne at the feet of a man who threw her away like a used napkin. She took Luca's hand. They walked out together, through the silence, through the frozen crowd, past Harrison, whose face had settled into an expression Vivian had never seen on him before. Not anger, not humiliation, but something rawer and more dangerous. Fear. And underneath the fear, growing already like a tumor in his chest, hatred, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that plans. They exited through the main doors while 400 guests exhaled simultaneously, and the Valmont Foundation Gala devolved into the most productive gossip session in Chicago's social history. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city gleamed wet and sharp beneath a sky the color of old iron. A black sedan idled at the curb, engine breathing heat into the cold air. Luca opened the rear door. Vivian stopped. "I don't even know you," she said. Luca looked at her steadily. "You know enough to know that what happened in there was wrong. That's not the same as knowing why you stopped it." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth, not exactly, More like the acknowledgement that she had asked the right question, and he hadn't expected that. "Get in the car, Vivian." She stiffened. "You know my name." "I know your father's name," he said quietly, "and I know what they did to him." The cold hit her then, not from the weather, from somewhere deeper, from the place where she kept every unanswered question about Raymond Mercer's destruction locked away, because looking at them directly was like staring into a wound that wouldn't close. "What do you know about my father?" she whispered. Luca studied her face for a long moment. "More than you're ready to hear on a sidewalk at 9 o'clock at night." Vivian's pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Every instinct screamed in opposite directions. Run, stay, trust him, fear him. She thought about the encrypted ledgers she'd found 3 nights earlier in her father's abandoned office. The ones she hadn't told anyone about. The ones connecting the Valmont empire to financial operations so massive and so criminal that even looking at the numbers made her hands shake. She thought about Luca DeSantis's name appearing in those ledgers. And she got in the car. The sedan pulled away from the Blackthorn Grand Hotel into streets shining with rain, carrying Vivian Mercer toward a truth she had spent 3 years starving for, and a world she was not remotely prepared to survive. 62 floors above, Harrison Valmont stood at the ballroom window watching the black sedan disappear into Chicago's wet darkness. His father appeared beside him. "Control yourself," Arthur said quietly. Harrison didn't look away from the window. "He humiliated me. He provoked you. There's a difference, and you will not react the way he wants you to react." Harrison's reflection stared back at him from the glass, distorted, rain-streaked, barely recognizable. "She's nobody," he muttered. Arthur Valmont placed both hands on his son's shoulders and turned him gently until they were face to face. "She was nobody," the senator corrected. "Now she's standing next to Luca DeSantis, and that makes her the most dangerous person in this city." Harrison searched his father's face for the reassurance he'd always found there, the unshakable confidence, the political certainty that every problem was just a negotiation waiting to happen. But what he saw instead for the first time in his life was something his father had never shown him before. Worry. Genuine, bone-deep worry. And somewhere deep in the machinery of Harrison Valmont's beautiful, broken mind, a gear shifted. Not toward caution, not toward reason, toward obsession. The sedan moved through Chicago's wet streets without hurry, the kind of pace that belonged to men who understood that urgency was just another form of panic dressed in expensive clothing. Vivian sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine rigid against the leather, watching the city slide past the rain-beaded window while her brain ran the same calculation on a loop. What she knew, what she didn't know, and whether the distance between those two things was enough to get her killed. Luca sat beside her, but not close. 18 inches of space between them, precise and deliberate. The way a man maintains distance, not from discomfort, but from respect, or the appearance of it. He'd removed his coat and folded it across his knees. His shirt was dark navy, the cuffs turned back twice at the wrists. He was looking straight ahead, jaw loose, breathing steady, like a man sitting in traffic and not in the back of a car with a woman who had reason to fear him. The driver didn't exist. That was how it felt. No introduction, no acknowledgement, the partition glass between front and back seats slightly fogged from condensation. Just the city and the rain and Luca DeSantis's profile outlined against passing streetlights. "Where are we going?" Vivian asked. "Somewhere quiet." That's not an answer. He turned to look at her, full attention, not gradual, like a switch thrown. "My apartment, Lake Shore. You can leave whenever you want. The door isn't locked." She held his gaze. It cost something to do that. She felt it, a physical expenditure, like pushing weight uphill. But she didn't look away. "You said you knew what they did to my father." "I do." "Then tell me, right now, in this car." Luca was quiet for a moment. "Your father found something," he said, "and before he could do anything with it, they made sure no one would believe him even if he tried." Vivian's throat tightened. "I know that part. You know the shape of it. You don't know the machinery." "Then show me the machinery." The sedan turned north onto Lakeshore Drive, and the lake appeared on their right, black and endless and violent in the way bodies of water get in November when the wind comes off them, horizontal and mean. Vivian stared at it for a second and then looked back at Luca. He was studying her the way she imagined he studied everything, not evaluating exactly, measuring, deciding how much weight the structure could hold before he applied more pressure. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight." He almost smiled. The corners of his mouth moved about 2 millimeters and then stopped, like they'd gotten permission and then had it revoked. "Tonight you're still in shock from what happened at the gala." "I've been in shock for 3 years," Vivian said. "I function fine in shock." The sedan pulled into the underground garage of a building on Lake Shore that Vivian recognized by reputation. 60-story residential tower, one of the city's most secure private addresses. 2 men materialized from a side door as the car stopped, not rushing, just present and large and positioned with the quiet precision of people who'd been doing this specific job long enough that readiness was just their resting state. Luca got out. Vivian got out on her own side before anyone could open the door for her. He noticed, said nothing. The elevator required a key card and a thumbprint, and it went directly to the top floor without stopping, which meant either the whole building was empty or the other residents had learned that certain floors were not part of their geography. The apartment doors opened into a foyer the size of Vivian's entire studio, and then the foyer opened into something that stopped her mid-step. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The lake to the east, the city to the south and west. 40 floors of Chicago spread beneath them like a circuit board somebody had set on fire. Rain still sheeted against the windows in gusts, and the light off the water moved constantly, gray and silver and occasionally a deep bruised purple, where the weather pressed hardest against the glass. The interior was spare in the way that only serious money can afford to be spare. No art on the walls except one large canvas above the fireplace. Abstract, dark blues and blacks. No discernible image. Expensive in the way that required education to understand. Long sectional sofa in dark charcoal. Steel-edged desk against the north wall covered in documents organized with the kind of obsessive precision that looked effortless but wasn't. 2 laptops. 1 landline phone. A glass of water that someone had placed there recently and no one had touched. No personal photographs. Vivian noticed that immediately. Not one. 2 men she hadn't seen in the car were already in the apartment. They stood near opposite walls with the affect of furniture that had been trained. One of them, late 30s, broad through the shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been poured from concrete, looked at Vivian with the specific assessment of a man deciding whether she was a threat. She held his gaze until he looked away. "Give us the room," Luca said. Both men exited through a side door. Whether they went down a floor or just into an adjacent space, Vivian couldn't tell. Luca moved to a low cabinet near the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. He brought one to her without asking if she wanted it. She took it because her mouth was dry from held tension, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Sit," he said. "I prefer to stand." He sat down on the sofa, which put him at a physical disadvantage relative to her standing position, and she understood immediately that he'd done it deliberately, ceding spatial dominance to make her more comfortable, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd played it aggressively. This was a man who understood leverage at the molecular level. 3 years ago, he said, your father was working a consulting contract for a pension fund in Springfield. Municipal employees, state workers, small accounts. The kind of work that stays invisible because there's nothing glamorous about it. Vivian knew this. She'd known every detail of her father's client list for years, had memorized it the way you memorize evidence in a case you've been building alone in the dark. He found irregularities, she said. He found a funnel. Luca set his water glass down with the specific care of a man making sure his hands were visible and still. Not irregularities. A deliberately constructed financial architecture designed to move money from public pension funds through a chain of shell corporations until it landed in private accounts controlled by 6 individuals. Valmont was one of them. Arthur Valmont was the architect. He'd been building the structure for 11 years before your father touched it. Luca leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. By the time Raymond Mercer started pulling threads, the money involved was significant enough that exposure meant federal charges. Not just Arthur. Everyone in the chain, judges, contractors, state officials who'd been taking disbursements annually for nearly a decade. Vivian's fingers tightened around the water glass. Not from fear, from the specific fury of hearing confirmed out loud what she'd spent 3 years trying to prove with nothing but instinct and encrypted files she barely understood. He was going to report it, she said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. He called a federal contact first, someone he trusted. Who? Luca's jaw moved slightly. The wrong person. The words dropped into the room like stones into deep water. The contact reported back to Valmont within 48 hours, Luca continued. After that, Raymond had approximately 3 weeks before the SEC investigation was manufactured against him. They worked fast because they had to. He knew too much, and they needed to destroy his credibility before he could use it. Vivian set the glass down on the coffee table because her hand was no longer entirely steady, and she didn't want to drop it. She'd known. On some cellular level, she'd known all of this, had felt the shape of it in the dark for 3 years. But knowing the shape of something and hearing someone describe the detail of its construction were entirely different experiences, and the difference hit her somewhere in the chest with a blunt, exhausting weight. Your name is in the ledgers, she said. Something moved across Luca's face. Not guilt. She watched for it carefully enough to be certain. Something older than guilt. Something that had already been processed and filed away in a part of himself he kept locked. They used a DeSantis shell corporation without authorization, he said. A company my father built in the 90s that I'd been in the process of dismantling when they grafted it onto the Valmont structure. Convenient. Incriminating, he corrected. For me, which is exactly why they chose it. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to believe that the most powerful criminal organization in Chicago got used as a prop in Arthur Valmont's financial crimes without noticing. I'm telling you what happened. That's not the same as proving it. Luca rose from the sofa. He crossed to the steel desk and opened the second drawer from the top, removed a manila folder and brought it to her, dropped it on the coffee table in front of her, sat back down. She opened it. Photographs. Bank transfer documentation. Internal communications printed from email accounts that had since been deleted. Timestamps. Account numbers. A chain of digital signatures so detailed and so specifically damning that even Vivian's non-specialist eyes could see the architecture of it. Who authorized what, when, and from where. The names made her stomach clench. She recognized 3 of them from court documents connected to her father's case. 2 were federal names, a prosecutor, a deputy assistant district attorney. 1 was a contractor whose company had won 17 consecutive city infrastructure bids over the previous decade. And at the top of every authorization chain, 1 name appeared consistently. Arthur Valmont. Where did you get this? She said quietly. I've been building it for 2 years. She looked up. Why? Luca was watching her with that still, measuring patience. Because they used my name, my family's company, my father's work. A pause. Small. Controlled. And because your father didn't deserve what they did to him. The silence between them stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. Vivian closed the folder carefully. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Something had moved past shaking, past the early chaotic emotion of revelation, and settled into something colder and more functional. The feeling you got when grief finished burning and left behind something harder and less forgiving. There's more, she said. It wasn't a question. There's always more. The ledgers I found in my father's office. She watched his face precisely. You knew about them. His expression didn't change. I knew he had documentation. I didn't know where he'd hidden it. How long have you known about his office? 6 months. But you didn't go get the files yourself. They weren't mine to take. Vivian stared at him. The answer was so precisely correct, so perfectly calibrated to either be genuine or to seem genuine, that she couldn't land on either side of it with confidence, which was exactly the problem with Luca DeSantis. Everything he did was simultaneously the right thing a good man would do and the smart thing a dangerous man would do. The 2 options occupied the same space, and she didn't have enough information yet to separate them. I need to think, she said. That's reasonable. I'm not staying here. I didn't ask you to. She stood, smoothed the rented dress with both palms, picked up her bag from where she'd set it near the door. At the threshold, she stopped. "If I find out you're using me the same way they used my father," she said, "I will find a way to damage you. I don't care how long it takes." Luca looked at her from across the room. "I believe you," he said simply. She left. The elevator ride down was 57 floors of standing very still and breathing very deliberately and refusing to process anything until she was outside and moving, and the night air hit her face like a cold compress applied to a burn. She walked 4 blocks before her hands started shaking again. She let them. The next 72 hours rearranged Vivian's life in ways that were irreversible before she fully understood they were happening. She called in sick to both jobs on Thursday, sat at her kitchen table with the encrypted files from her father's office laid out in every sequence she could think of, cross-referencing against what Luca had shown her, running the numbers and the names and the dates through the forensic logic her father had taught her, before she understood it was a survival skill and not just intellectual habit. He'd been teaching her to see what he saw, the whole time. She understood that now. By Friday evening, she had a clearer picture of the structure, not complete, not prosecutable, but coherent enough that she could see where the holes were and what would be needed to fill them. She also understood clearly why the Valmont organization had moved so quickly to destroy her father. The documentation Vivian Mercer had assembled, combined with the files Luca held, was significant enough to demolish not just Arthur Valmont, but the entire political and financial infrastructure that had grown around him over 4 decades. She called Luca at a number he'd given her on a card she'd found in her bag that she didn't remember him putting there. He answered on the second ring. "I need to see the rest," she said. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Tonight." A pause. Brief. 8 a.m., he repeated and hung up. She went to his apartment at 7:55. What followed was the beginning of something she didn't have accurate language for. Not partnership exactly, and not trust. Trust required time and evidence, and she had insufficient quantities of both. But a functional alignment, a shared direction. Over the following 2 weeks, Vivian sat across from Luca in that high apartment above the lake, while rain and then early snow battered the glass, working through documents and recordings and financial trails that painted Chicago's power structure in colors that were genuinely nauseating to look at directly. She met 2 intermediaries, a federal investigator named Ortega, who had been building a parallel case for 18 months and whose involvement gave the operation a legitimacy that Luca's name alone could never provide, and a forensic accountant named Kessler, who had been quietly retained to structure the evidence for eventual prosecution. Neither of them knew the other existed. That was Luca's architecture, compartmentalization as a survival strategy. Vivian watched him operate and understood why the city feared him. Not because of violence, she'd seen no violence, but because of the specific intelligence he applied to every situation, the way he mapped systems and people and motivations with the kind of cold accuracy that made the rest of the world feel like it was running on emotion while he was running on physics. She also watched him watch her, not in the way Harrison had watched her, as property being assessed, as a variable in someone else's equation. The way Luca watched her was different, attentive without being possessive, present without being intrusive. He listened when she spoke with the full, focused engagement of a man who'd learned that information came from unexpected places, if you were patient enough to receive it. It was, she realized reluctantly, the most respectful she'd felt in years, which made him more dangerous, not less. She understood that intellectually, even as something in her chest shifted incrementally in his direction with every passing day. She pushed it down. She had things to finish. 13 days after the gala, Harrison made his first move. It started with her phone. An alert from a news aggregator she'd set up for her own name, a vanity tool she'd built during the early months of her father's case, when monitoring information was all the agency she had. The alert had never fired in 2 years. It fired at 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. She read the article sitting up in bed, still in the previous night's clothes because she'd fallen asleep at her desk, and migrated to the mattress sometime around 3 without fully waking. The piece ran on a mid-tier political blog with decent traffic and a history of placing stories that originated from the Valmont political machine. The headline was almost elegant in its viciousness. Mafia connection? DeSantis's mystery woman linked to father's fraud case. They'd used a photo from the gala. Someone had captured the moment, Luca kissing her hand, her face turned slightly toward him, the chandeliers above them throwing light that made the whole thing look at the worst possible angle, like intimacy rather than intervention. The article called her his mistress. It recycled the SEC charges against her father, without noting that he died before trial, without noting that the charges had been disputed, presenting the accusations as established fact with the editorial confidence of a story that had been legally reviewed before publication. It implied, without stating directly, that Vivian had cultivated a relationship with DeSantis to access organized crime resources for personal financial gain. It mentioned her 2 jobs. It mentioned the studio apartment. It mentioned the rented dress she'd worn to the gala, sourced from an unnamed guest close to the foundation committee. Someone at the gala had researched her rental receipt. The level of preparation behind the piece was significant. This wasn't reactive fury. It had been building before the gala, before the night happened, which meant Harrison, or his father, had anticipated some version of this confrontation and had material prepared. By 9 a.m., 3 additional outlets had republished versions of the story. By noon, Vivian's supervisor at the accounting firm called and suggested she take personal time for the foreseeable future, in a tone that made clear the suggestion was a termination without the paperwork. She sat with her phone in her hand for a long moment after that call ended, feeling the familiar weight of everything being pulled away. It was the same weight she'd felt 3 years ago, the same mechanism: public story first, institutional pressure second, isolation third. They were running the same playbook they'd run against her father. She texted Luca. "They're moving." His response came in 40 seconds. "I know. Come in." She went. The atmosphere in the apartment was different that afternoon. Both the men she'd seen the first night were present, plus a third she hadn't met, younger, harder looking, with the specific wariness of someone who'd recently been in a situation that went wrong. Ortega was there too, standing near the window with his coat still on, which meant he'd arrived recently and hadn't decided yet whether he was staying. Luca was on the phone when she came in. He ended the call without saying goodbye. "3 more outlets are picking it up," he said. "I lost my job." The room adjusted slightly. The younger man near the door looked at the floor. Ortega turned from the window. Luca said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said then. Flat, without performance. Just the words. "I don't need sorry," Vivian said. "I need to accelerate the timeline." Ortega cleared his throat. "We're not ready to accelerate. They're coming after me publicly. If they go hard enough, my credibility as a witness is damaged before we file anything." "She's right," Luca said. Ortega looked at him sharply. "We need another 3 weeks minimum to—" "They won't give us 3 weeks," Vivian moved toward the desk where the documentation was spread. "Look at the structure of the campaign against my father. Between the first press piece and the SEC filing, there were 19 days. They move fast when they feel threatened, and they feel threatened right now." Ortega studied her, then looked at Luca. "You trust her analysis?" "I trust her father taught her well," Luca said. Something passed between the 2 men that Vivian couldn't fully read, a complicated negotiation conducted entirely in the space between sentences. Ortega finally nodded. 2 weeks, not 3. I'll push my contacts." After he left, Luca's men drifted out of the room with the practiced tact of people paid to understand when conversations required privacy. Vivian stood at the windows looking out at the lake. The water was iron gray and chapped white at the surface where the wind dragged across it. "You know they won't stop at reputation," she said. "No. Harrison isn't built for restraint. He'll escalate past public." "I know." She turned from the window. "You've been watching him." "I watch everything relevant." "And?" Luca leaned against the edge of the desk with his arms crossed and looked at her with that still, dark attention that she'd stopped trying to decode and started simply receiving. "He's been making calls. 3 to a private security firm in Indiana with a history of working gray area contracts. 1 to a man in Bridgeport I've dealt with before." Vivian's chest tightened. "What does that mean specifically?" "It means he's angry enough to be stupid," Luca said, "and well-resourced enough to make stupidity dangerous. She held his gaze. How many people are watching my apartment? 2. They rotate every 4 hours. She'd had no idea. She absorbed this, the fact that her movements had been monitored, presumably for her own safety, and searched herself for the expected indignation and found something more complicated beneath it. Something that recognized the protection as genuine even while resisting the dependency it implied. I don't want to be someone who needs watching, she said. What you want and what's necessary aren't the same thing right now. No, she agreed. They're not. She crossed to the sofa and sat down properly for the first time in days, and only then registered how exhausted she was. Not sleepy, but the bone-level tiredness of sustained vigilance, of keeping the guard up for so many consecutive hours that the muscles involved had started to ache from overuse. Luca brought her coffee from the kitchen without being asked. She took it. They sat in the kind of silence that two people arrive at when they've talked through everything urgent and what's left is just the shared weight of what's coming. My father trusted the wrong person, she said finally, made one call to someone he thought was safe and it destroyed everything. Yes. How do I know I'm not doing the same thing? The question sat in the room. Luca set his own coffee down. He looked at his hands for a moment, both of them, spread flat on his knees, and then looked up at her. You don't, he said. Not with certainty. You make the best decision available with the information you have, and you stay sharp enough to adjust when you're wrong. And if I'm wrong about you? Then you'll figure that out before it kills you. You're too careful not to. It was not the reassurance she wanted. She understood it was the only honest answer available. She nodded slowly. She stayed another hour, then went home through a cold that had intensified while they talked, the kind of Chicago cold that felt personal, like the weather had decided to run its own version of a pressure campaign. The two men watching her building were invisible. She knew they were there and still couldn't identify them, which she supposed was the point. She unlocked her apartment door, pushed it open. The lights were already on. Harrison Valmont was sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of water he'd poured himself from her tap, his coat folded over the back of the chair beside him, his face carrying the specific composed calm of a man who'd been waiting long enough that his anger had shifted into something colder and more deliberate. We need to have a conversation, he said. Vivian stood in the open doorway. Her keys were still in her hand. The cold from the hallway pressed against her back. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at him, and understood. With the clarity of someone who'd been running from an inevitable collision long enough to recognize when the running was over, that whatever happened in the next few minutes was going to change every remaining calculation in ways she couldn't yet predict and she didn't move back from the doorway. That was the first decision, small, physical, instinctive, and she made it without thinking, planting her feet on the threshold between the hallway and her own apartment like the 2 inches of floor space constituted a meaningful boundary, which she knew it didn't, but her body needed the geometry anyway. Harrison looked at her with the patient expression of a man who had decided ahead of time how this conversation would go and was prepared to wait through whatever she did before it arrived at his predetermined destination. Close the door, Vivian. No. The word came out flat and clean. No tremor in it. She was proud of that, privately, briefly, before she remembered that tone was cosmetic and circumstances were not. Harrison tilted his head slightly. The composed calm on his face tightened at the edges. We can talk in the hallway if you prefer, he said. I'm flexible. How did you get in? Your building manager is a practical man, which meant money, which meant he'd been planning this specific intrusion long enough to identify the right person to bribe and execute it, which meant this wasn't impulsive. This was constructed. The distinction mattered, and she filed it away behind her sternum where she kept things that required processing later. You need to leave, she said. I need 5 minutes. You need to leave. Harrison stood up slowly. He was deliberate about it, unfolding from the chair without urgency, straightening his jacket, the kind of physical performance that said, I am not threatened by this room or this woman or anything in this conversation. He moved around the table until he was on her side of it, and the apartment was small enough that the distance between them became uncomfortable. You think he's going to protect you, Harrison said. Not a question. Statement of diagnosis, like a doctor naming a delusion. Vivian said nothing. You think because Luca DeSantis kissed your hand at my family's gala, you're untouchable now. He paused. You're not. You're exactly as touchable as you were before. Maybe more so because now you're associated with a federal target. He's been a federal target for 14 years and he's still standing. Things change. Something in his tone shifted when he said that, something specific, a weight behind the words that didn't belong to a threat, belonged to information. Vivian's skin prickled. What does that mean? She said carefully. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way jaws work when people are deciding how much of their hand to show. It means your new protector has problems he hasn't told you about, Harrison said. It means the federal case against DeSantis is not dormant. It's been active for 7 months. And it means whoever he's been feeding information to inside the federal system, another pause, weighted, deliberate, isn't necessarily feeding it in the direction he thinks. Vivian's fingers tightened around her keys. You're lying. Am I? Not a question, delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who knew the difference between bluffing and holding cards. You're trying to isolate me from the one person with enough documentation to bring down your family. My family, Harrison said softly, has survived 4 federal investigations, 2 congressional inquiries, and 30 years of people exactly like you and your father deciding they were going to be the ones who finally broke us. He took one step closer, just one. We're still here. Your father is under active investigation. My father has been under active investigation for 11 years. He still sits on 3 federal advisory boards and had dinner with the Attorney General 6 weeks ago. Harrison's voice was steady, certain. You want to know why? Because the people running the investigations are connected to the same infrastructure my father built. Because loyalty in this city runs in circles, not lines. The cold that moved through Vivian then wasn't physical. It was the cold of understanding something she'd been keeping at arm's length because understanding it fully meant confronting how outgunned she actually was. What do you want, Harrison? I want you to walk away. He said it simply, no theatrics. Take whatever Luca's promised you and understand that promises made by men like him are contingent on their continued freedom. Stop pursuing this. Rebuild your life somewhere else. There are cities that aren't Chicago. You destroyed my father. My family made a decision that protected a great many people and their livelihoods. Your father, don't. The word came out with more velocity than she intended. Her hand was shaking now, the keys rattling slightly against her palm. Don't characterize what you did to him. Don't reframe it. Don't make it into something administrative. Harrison stopped. For a moment, brief, small, insufficient, something moved across his face that might have been the distant cousin of guilt. A ghost of the person he might have been if he'd been built differently, raised differently, taught to count things other than leverage. Then it was gone. Walk away, he said again. No. The composed calm finally cracked. Not explosively. Harrison wasn't built for explosions. He was built for controlled pressure. But the crack was audible in the change of his breathing, the slight forward lean of his shoulders. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Then it's mine to make. He grabbed her wrist. The same wrist. The same grip as before. Hard enough to bruise, positioned precisely to hurt, without leaving marks that cameras would read as unambiguous. His face was 6 inches from hers, and his eyes had gone flat in the way she'd seen them go flat twice before. And both previous times, something had broken or been broken shortly afterward. You were nothing before my family decided you were something, he said, low, almost intimate. You will be nothing again faster than you can imagine. The apartment door behind her exploded inward. Not a knock, not a warning. The door swung so hard it hit the interior wall and bounced, and 2 men came through the frame with the focused efficiency of people who had been standing very close on the other side waiting for exactly this moment. The first one, the broad-shouldered man from Luca's apartment whose jaw looked like formed concrete, crossed the room in 4 steps and removed Harrison's hand from Vivian's wrist with the specific technique of someone who knew exactly how much force to apply to a joint to make it release without breaking. Harrison gasped. Small. Involuntary. The second man positioned himself between Harrison and the door. Then Luca walked in. He was not running. He never ran. He moved through the doorway of Vivian's studio apartment the same way he moved through every space, at exactly the pace he'd decided on before he arrived, with the full weight of his attention already distributed across the room before his body completed the transit. He looked at Vivian first, her wrist, her face, the keys in her hand and the way she was holding them. Then he looked at Harrison. The room's temperature changed, not metaphorically. The air in the apartment actually seemed to cool by several degrees, the way basements cool when you descend into them, when you move from the inhabited world into something older and less forgiving. Harrison straightened, tried to reassemble the composed authority that had occupied his face before it got grabbed. "This is breaking and entering," he said. "She left the door open," Luca said. She left the door open," Luca repeated. Same words, different weight the second time. Harrison's mouth closed. Luca crossed to the kitchen table and looked at the glass Harrison had poured from Vivian's tap and left there. He looked at it for a long moment, the way a person looks at evidence of an intrusion, seeing not just the object, but everything it represented about the decision to be in this room. "You put your hands on her," Luca said. Not loudly, stating a fact for the record. "We were having a private conversation. You put your hands on her." Harrison forced something resembling confidence into his posture. "My father still has relationships with every federal judge in this district, every one. You want to have a conversation about boundaries? Your father," Luca said quietly, "is running out of judges." Something flickered in Harrison's eyes. "You think your little federal case is going to—" "I think you drove here tonight instead of sending someone," Luca said, "which means you're scared enough to handle this personally. Which means whatever composure you're performing right now is the last of it." He took one step toward Harrison, just one. "You're not here to threaten her. You're here because you're panicking, and the only playbook you know is intimidation, and she's the most accessible target." Harrison said nothing. "Leave," Luca said. "Don't come back to this building. Don't contact her by any channel. Don't have people contact her." He paused. "This is the one time I explain the rules. I don't explain them twice." Harrison looked at him with the flat eyes and the jaw work and the visible effort of a man consolidating his remaining pride into a shape small enough to exit with. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "You keep saying that," Luca said. "I keep not making different choices." Harrison picked up his coat from the back of the chair, folded it over his arm with the deliberate care of a man performing dignity for an audience that wasn't buying it. He walked out. The second man tracked him to the building exit. The room was quiet. Vivian set her keys on the counter with a controlled precision that was entirely about managing her hands, which wanted badly to shake. "How long were you outside?" she asked. "Long enough." "You heard what he said about your federal case." Luca turned from the window where he'd tracked Harrison's exit. His face was neutral. That specific practice neutral that Vivian had come to understand was not blankness, but containment. A face that looked like nothing was happening because what was happening was being processed somewhere internal and not yet available for display. "I heard," he said. "Is it true?" A pause. Measured. "Which part?" "The part where someone you're feeding information to isn't sending it where you think." She watched his face with the forensic precision her father had taught her, looking for the micro-contractions, the blink rate changes, the jaw movements that happened before verbal decisions were made. "Is that true?" Luca was very still. "I don't know yet," he said. 3 words. Quiet. And in those 3 words, Vivian heard something she had not heard from Luca DeSantis in 2 weeks of close observation. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that didn't come from incomplete information. The kind that came from beginning to suspect that information you'd treated as reliable had been compromised. The cold returned. "Who is it?" she said. "Who inside your organization knew enough about the federal contacts to compromise the channel?" "I'm working on that." "Luca." She said his name with enough weight to make him look at her directly, not at the middle distance where he'd been running calculations. "If someone inside your operation has been feeding information in the wrong direction for 7 months, Then every move we've made in the last 2 weeks, Ortega, Kessler, the documentation, the timeline, may be known, he finished. The words landed in the room like the sound a structural beam makes when it cracks. Not collapse, not yet, but the sound that precedes it, the warning that something weight-bearing has failed. Vivian sat down on the edge of her bed because her legs made the decision before she did. 2 weeks. They'd spent 2 weeks building a case architecture they believed was secure, compartmentalized. Luca's system, keep Ortega and Kessler separated, keep Vivian's involvement invisible, feed documentation forward in pieces small enough that no single person held the whole picture. If someone inside Luca's organization had been watching not just recently, but from before the Gala, from before Vivian was even part of this, then the compartmentalization was theater. The security was performance, and everything they'd built was visible to the people they were building it against. Who knew about all of it, she said. Who in your organization had enough access to see the whole structure? Luca turned from the window fully, and she saw it in his face. Not panic. Luca didn't panic, but the specific controlled tightening of a man who had run the same calculation and arrived at the same destination and did not like where it was. 3 people had full access, he said. Ortega and Kessler weren't mine. Of my own people. He stopped. How many? 2. Names. He looked at her for a moment. Marco, he said. And Reyes. Vivian filed the names. Which one? I don't know. You have to have a sense. If I had a sense, I would have addressed it already. His voice carried the first edge she'd heard in it since she'd known him. Not anger, but the friction of a man whose control was being tested by the proximity of something he couldn't resolve through patience and preparation. I'm working with incomplete information. We need to move faster than 2 weeks. Moving faster increases exposure. Staying at 2 weeks assumes the architecture is still secure. It's not. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The negotiation lasted about 4 seconds. I need to make calls, he said. Make them. He stepped into the hallway with his phone. The broad-shouldered man took a position near the door with the low-profile readiness of furniture that had decided to be vigilant. Vivian sat on her bed in her rented silver dress that she still hadn't returned because the last 2 weeks had been the kind of 2 weeks where dress returns didn't register as urgent, and looked at the wall of her studio apartment, the water stain near the corner, the places where the paint had peeled back from the radiator heat, the framed photo of her father on the shelf near the window that she'd kept face up through 3 years of everything, and thought about betrayal. Not Luca's, necessarily. Not yet. Her father's betrayal. The one that had started all of this. The trusted federal contact who had taken Raymond Mercer's call and turned it into a weapon against him within 48 hours. Someone Raymond trusted completely, trusted enough to call before anyone else, trusted enough that calling them felt like the beginning of the solution rather than the end of everything. Loyalty in this city runs in circles, not lines. Harrison's words, said with contempt and certainty. The certainty of a man who had grown up inside the machinery of exactly that circularity and understood it as natural law rather than corruption. Luca came back into the apartment 11 minutes later. His face had changed, not dramatically, but the specific quality of his neutrality had shifted, from the containment of processing to the containment of having processed and not liking the result. Marco's not reachable, he said. Vivian stood up. Since when? Since approximately 6 hours ago. 6 hours. The timeline arranged itself in her head with the cold efficiency of numbers. 6 hours ago, Harrison was already inside her building, had already paid the building manager, was already in position at her kitchen table, which meant whatever Marco had communicated, whenever he'd communicated it, had been early enough to coordinate Harrison's visit. He told them about tonight, she said. It's possible. It's not possible, Luca. He told them you were watching my apartment. Harrison came here knowing your men were outside. He came through the building manager because he knew the front approach was covered. Luca absorbed this with the absolute stillness of a man who'd spent his entire adult life in situations where panic was fatal. We need to move Kessler, he said. Now? Now. He made another call. 40 seconds. Clipped, specific, no wasted syllables. When he hung up, His face carried something it hadn't carried before, something that required her a moment to name, because she'd been operating under the assumption it wasn't part of his emotional vocabulary. Anger. Not the performative anger of men who used it for display. The real kind. Quiet and absolute. And very, very cold. "Kessler's not answering," he said. The room went still. Vivian heard her own heartbeat with unusual clarity. "Try again," she said. "I've tried 4 times." She crossed to the window. Outside, Chicago moved through its night without knowing or caring that 2 people in a 3rd-floor studio apartment were watching the entire architecture of 2 years of careful work begin to understand it was standing on a floor that had been cut away beneath it. "Ortega," she said. Luca was already dialing. It rang 6 times. 7, 8. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, flat, carrying the specific cadence of federal protocol, answered and said, "This phone is currently secured as part of an ongoing federal investigation. If you have information relevant to—" Luca ended the call. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vivian had heard in years. She turned from the window. Luca was standing with the phone at his side and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the middle distance again, but the calculation running behind them now had a different character. Not strategic planning, but damage assessment. The specific cognitive work of a man determining how much of what he'd built was still standing and how much had already collapsed. "Ortega is federal," Vivian said carefully. "Yes. If his phone is secured, if they've picked him up or compromised him, then everything he was carrying is accessible to them, yes. The documentation, the timeline, the names. All of it, potentially." Vivian pressed both palms flat against the windowsill and looked out at the city and made herself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her father had taught her to breathe when numbers weren't adding up, and the answer was going to be worse than the question. "They've known," she said. "How long have they known?" "I don't know." "Guess." "I don't guess." "Estimate with available data." A long pause. She heard him breathe behind her, a single, controlled exhale. "If Marco was compromised before the gala," Luca said, "and I have to consider that possible, then potentially from the beginning, from the night you got in the car." From the beginning. The phrase took everything she'd built in 2 weeks and inverted it. Every conversation in that apartment above the lake. Every document she'd examined, every name she'd been shown. Every piece of the picture she'd assembled with the careful, desperate hope that she was finally close to completing something her father had died trying to finish. Visible. All of it. Potentially visible to the people who destroyed her father and would not hesitate to destroy her. She turned from the window. "Then we have nothing," she said. "We have the original files," Luca said. "Your father's files. They don't know where those are." "You don't know that." "Marco didn't know about the office. I didn't tell him." "How certain are you?" "Certain enough to operate on." She looked at him. This man who had entered her life 3 weeks ago with a gesture of public protection that she still didn't fully understand, who had shown her evidence that felt genuine and given her access to a case that felt real, who had operated with a precision and a patience that she'd found herself trusting more than she'd intended to. And now she was standing in her apartment asking how much of it was real and how much had been visible to her enemies the entire time, and the answer was she didn't know, and neither did he. "Is there anyone left?" she asked. "Anyone in your organization that isn't potentially compromised?" Luca looked at her steadily. "Reyes," he said. "I trust Reyes." "You trusted Marco." "Reyes is different." "How?" "Because Reyes has reasons that aren't about money." He said it simply, not defensively. As a fact he'd verified through means he wasn't going to detail in a studio apartment at 11 p.m. Vivian pressed her thumb and forefinger against her eyes for a moment, hard enough to see pressure ghosts. Then she dropped her hand and looked at him again. "We need the recordings," she said. Luca's eyes sharpened. "What recordings?" It wasn't a question. It was the specific response of a man who knew exactly what she meant and wanted to hear her say it to confirm she had the same information he did. "My father didn't just collect documents," she said. "He collected audio. Harrison implied it. He said recordings, plural, which wasn't information I shared with you, which means either Harrison knows things from the original operation, or... She stopped. Or Marco talked about them, Luca said quietly, which means they know the recordings exist, but not where. Do you know where? Luca was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Your father left more than documents in that office, he said. Vivian went cold to her fingertips. You knew. I knew there was a second safe. You knew about a second safe and you didn't tell me. I didn't know what was in it. His voice was level, but she could hear the structural tension underneath it now, the sound of a man who'd made a calculated omission and was now accounting for the cost of it. Your father was careful. He never documented the recordings directly. I knew they existed from a source that's now compromised. I didn't know if the second safe was still intact or if it had been accessed. Vivian stared at him. The fury was clean and immediate. Not the hot kind, the cold kind, the kind that had a specific physical sensation like ice water replacing blood. You've been running your own compartments, she said. Not just from Ortega and Kessler, from me. Yes. Why? Luca held her gaze without flinching. Because you're Raymond Mercer's daughter, and that makes you both the most motivated person in this operation and the most emotionally exposed. I needed to know how you operated under pressure before I gave you everything. The words were honest. She hated that they were honest. She'd have preferred a manageable lie, something she could push back against cleanly, some tactical deception she could file as evidence against him and use to justify the distance she should have been maintaining anyway. Instead, she got the truth, which was worse, because the truth was that he'd been right, and being right about her vulnerability was exactly the kind of understanding that made Luca DeSantis either the most valuable ally she had or the most dangerous man in the city. She still didn't know which. We need to get to that office tonight, she said. It's not safe. Nowhere is safe. The office was safe 48 hours ago. I don't know if it's safe now. Every hour we wait is an hour they have to figure out what they're missing. She picked up her keys from the counter. The recordings are the only thing that aren't potentially already in their hands. Audio of Arthur Valmont's voice saying things he can't deny. That's not replicable. That's not replaceable. That's the one piece that doesn't exist anywhere else. Luca looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him and didn't drop her gaze and didn't adjust her position and didn't perform composure, just held the ground of her own decision with the particular stubbornness of someone who'd had every other ground taken from them and had decided this one wasn't going anywhere. Reyes drives, he said finally. We go in and out fast. 15 minutes maximum. Agreed. He pulled out his phone and made the call. 4 sentences. Coordinates. Time. Then he looked at her. Change your clothes, he said. Wear something you can move in. She changed in the bathroom, dark jeans, flat boots, her father's old university sweatshirt that she'd kept because it still smelled faintly of him on cold nights, though she'd never admitted that to anyone and wouldn't start now. She came out to find Luca standing at the shelf near the window, looking at the framed photo. Her father, Raymond Mercer, standing in front of his old firm's building on a summer afternoon, squinting into the sun, one hand raised to shade his eyes, wearing the rumpled blazer he refused to replace because it fit right, smiling the way people smile when they don't know a photograph is being taken. The last good year, before everything. Luca didn't touch the photo. Just looked at it. Then he stepped back from the shelf and turned toward the door, and Vivian noticed in the specific quality of how he moved away from the image, something she wasn't prepared for, a weight in the motion, something that suggested the photograph had cost him something to look at. She filed it without comment. They took the stairs down. The car was already at the curb, a different vehicle than the black sedan, a dark blue SUV with the engine running and the lights off. A man she recognized as Reyes from 2 brief sightings over the previous 2 weeks sat behind the wheel. Late 30s, lean, with the quiet eyes of someone who'd been in bad situations and learned from them rather than been broken by them. The drive to the Bridgeport office took 19 minutes through empty late-night streets. Nobody spoke. Reyes drove with the focused economy of someone who'd done this specific kind of work before and understood that conversation was a resource better conserved. The building looked the same as the last time Vivian had been here, a two-story commercial property that had been her father's firm for 11 years before the lease lapsed and the space stood empty, too marked by its history for new tenants. The ground floor had been a dry cleaning business that closed 2 years ago. The second floor had been Raymond Mercer's. Reyes killed the engine half a block away. They approached on foot. The stairwell door was unlocked. It should not have been unlocked. Vivian stopped on the second step. Luca's hand found her arm, not a grip, a contact, his fingers on her forearm communicating stop without sound. She'd left the building locked. She was certain of it. She'd checked the door twice the night she found the ledgers because she was her father's daughter, and her father had checked locks twice. The door was unlocked. They stood in the stairwell with the cold pressing through the walls and the sound of the city muffled to almost nothing, and the darkness above them on the second floor landing carrying the specific quality of darkness that has been recently occupied. Luca reached inside his coat. She heard the soft mechanical sound of a weapon being readied and understood, in the full-body way that bypasses thought, that everything she'd spent 3 years carefully and legally building toward had just stepped across a line that professional investigators and encrypted files and federal intermediaries could not follow it. Luca moved first, not fast, controlled. The difference mattered. Fast was reactive. Controlled was intentional. And intentional meant he'd already run the geometry of the stairwell and the landing above and the door at the top and made decisions about all of it before his foot left the second step. He went up with his back to the wall, weapon low, Vivian 2 steps behind him with her hand on the railing and her breath coming shallow and quiet, the way breathing goes when the body understands that sound is now a liability. Reyes stayed at the bottom. She heard him move to cover the entrance without being told, the soft scrape of boot on concrete, the specific stillness that followed. The landing was empty. The door to her father's office stood open 4 inches, not wide, not the careless open of someone who'd left in a hurry, the precise open of someone who'd gone through and left it cracked for a reason, for listening, for monitoring, for maintaining a line of information between inside and out. Light came through the gap, low, artificial. Not the overhead fluorescence she'd used the night she found the ledgers, but something directional, a flashlight or a work lamp positioned to illuminate a specific area without broadcasting through the windows. Luca looked back at her. His eyes asked the question without his mouth moving. She held up 2 fingers. 2 windows in the main room, one overlooking the alley, one facing the street. Then she held up 1 finger and pointed left. One internal wall with the built-in shelving unit her father had installed himself, badly. The shelves never quite level, a fact he'd found charming about himself in the way that people find charming the small imperfections that make them human. The safe was behind the 3rd shelf from the bottom on the left side. She knew because she'd found it. She knew there was a second one because Luca had told her in her apartment 40 minutes ago, and she'd had 40 minutes of car ride and stairwell darkness to hate him for not telling her sooner. Luca pushed the door open with his shoulder, smooth and continuous. No hesitation in the motion. The office hit her in the face like a fist made of memory. The smell first, old paper and dust and the specific atmospheric residue of years of concentrated mental work, numbers and anxiety, and long nights, and coffee gone cold on a desk edge. Her father's smell, essentially. The smell of his professional life preserved in walls that hadn't been regularly aired since he died. Then the light. A work lamp on the floor pointed at the far wall. The shelving unit. The 3rd shelf from the bottom, which was no longer in its original position because someone had pulled it partially away from the wall, not far, 8 or 10 inches, and was kneeling in the space behind it with a drill in their hands, and the pieces of the drywall anchor for the safe's mounting hardware scattered on the floor around their knees. The person heard them. They came up fast from the crouch, fast enough that the transition from kneeling to standing happened in a single fluid motion that spoke to training, to muscle memory, to a body that had been in urgent situations before and had stopped thinking about the mechanics of moving quickly and simply did it. Marco. Vivian recognized him from the peripheral glimpses she'd accumulated over 2 weeks. The broad features, the heavy build carrying more muscle than his suit suggested, the dark hair cut close on the sides, late 40s. A face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had since been rearranged by time and choices into something harder and less readable. He had a weapon up before he finished standing. Luca already had his aimed. The two men looked at each other across Raymond Mercer's empty office, with 4 feet of dusty floor between them and the work lamp throwing hard shadows up both their faces, and the second safe sitting open on the floor behind Marco like an accusation. Open. The safe was open. The door hung at 45 degrees, the combination mechanism on its face, the interior visible from where Vivian stood. Dark, empty. Whatever had been inside it already removed and placed into the black bag sitting on the floor beside Marco's left knee, her father's recordings. Already in the bag. Already gone. Marco. Luca's voice was the quietest thing in the room. It carried anyway. The way whispers carry in empty buildings, amplified by absence. Marco's breathing was audible, fast, controlled at the edges but not at the center, where the body's panic ran independent of the mind's instructions. Put it down, Luca. You know I'm not going to do that. Then we have a problem. We had a problem before tonight. Luca's eyes didn't move from Marco's face, didn't track to the bag, didn't assess the door behind him, didn't perform any of the nervous spatial calculations that most people did in situations like this. Just Marco's face, steady and total. How long? The question sat between them. Marco's jaw worked. How long, Marco? 8 months. Flat, like a man confessing to something he'd stopped feeling guilty about long enough ago that the guilt had fossilized into mere fact. 8 months. The number landed on Vivian with physical weight. 8 months before the gala. 8 months before Luca approached her on that ballroom floor. 8 months of Marco carrying information in 2 directions, loyal face forward while feeding backward, which meant the entire architecture of Luca's operation during that period was compromised, which meant everything Luca had built was built on a foundation that already had a fracture running through it. Valmont, Luca said. Valmont's people. Marco's weapon hand was steady, but his eyes were doing the rapid micro-calculations of a man running scenarios. Exit angles. Response times. Probabilities. They came to me. Made a case. What case? That you were going to get everyone around you killed. Marco's voice carried something that might have been conviction. Not performed, not tactical, but the genuine article. The belief of a man who'd told himself a story long enough that it had become his truth. That this crusade of yours, burning down the city's infrastructure, destroying relationships that kept people safe, that it was going to cost lives. Our people's lives. And the money they paid you had nothing to do with it. Marco's eyes tightened. The weapon didn't move. The money, he said, was acknowledgement, recognition, of the risk I was taking. The money, Luca said, was the point. Everything else was the story you told yourself so you could sleep. The silence between them was the kind that precedes either resolution or catastrophe, balanced on a point so fine that the difference between the 2 outcomes was measured in fractions of seconds and millimeters of trigger movement. Vivian was looking at the bag. She was cataloging the distance between herself and it. 12 feet, slightly to Marco's left and slightly behind him. She could see the bag because of the angle she'd entered from, just inside the door and to the right, while Luca had moved left and forward. Marco's attention was on Luca. His weapon was on Luca. His entire threat assessment had been calibrated to the armed man with the history and the reputation and the gun, which was reasonable threat assessment but incomplete threat assessment because it had failed to fully account for the woman by the door. Her father's daughter, who had been watching this specific bag since the moment she understood what it contained. "Give me the bag, Marco," Luca said. "Can't do that. You're not walking out of here with it. I'm not walking out of here without it. They'll kill me if I come back empty. I'll kill you if you leave with it. Then we're at the same place regardless." Marco's voice had gone to something resigned. The specific register of a man who's done the math and found that the available outcomes are uniformly bad, and has decided that resolution of any kind is preferable to the suspension of waiting for it. At least this way I gave them what they wanted. At least this way it means something. It doesn't mean anything. Luca said quietly. It means you were afraid, and you made a bad choice, and you spent 8 months compounding it. Something cracked in Marco's face. Not the weapon hand. The face. The eyes specifically. The particular fracture that opened up when a true thing was said to someone who'd been living in the architecture of a false one. That was the moment Vivian moved. Not dramatically. Not with a running start, or a shout, or any of the theatrical apparatus of action. Just a shift. Weight forward onto her left foot, right foot following, 3 steps covering ground she'd already measured, and her hand closing around the strap of the black bag. Marco reacted. He was fast. Trained fast. He spun, and his free hand came down toward the bag with the speed of someone whose instincts had been refined by years of situations where objects were either weapons or leverage, and the difference between holding them and losing them was everything. His hand hit her wrist, hard. The impact ran up her arm to the shoulder, and she felt the grip on the bag strap slip. Not gone, not entirely, but compromised, her fingers opening slightly from the shock of contact and the bag dropping to the floor between them. Marco grabbed for it. Vivian dropped to her knee and got both hands on it and pulled. The weight of him was enormous. She felt it in her lower back, in her shoulders, in the tendons of both wrists where the strap bit into skin. The raw physics of a larger body applying force in one direction while she applied everything she had in the opposite direction, and everything she had was considerably less. The gun went off. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous. Not the movie sound, clean and directional, but the real sound. The sound that occupied all available air and compressed it simultaneously and left a ringing absence behind it that lasted and lasted. Plaster from the wall above the window. A miss. Intentional or otherwise, she couldn't determine and didn't have time to. Luca crossed the room. Not the controlled, measured pace of a man managing a situation. Fast. Finally fast. The speed of a man whose patience had a specific threshold, and this was it. And Marco heard him coming and turned, and the two of them met in the middle of the floor, with the full weight of 8 months of betrayal and 20 years of shared history between them, and it was not elegant, and it was not clean. It was 2 men who knew each other's fighting patterns trying to use that knowledge simultaneously against each other, which meant every defensive movement was anticipated, and every offensive movement was partially countered, and what it produced was close, grinding, physical ugliness, bodies locked together, leverage attempted and broken, breathing loud and ragged in the lamplight. Vivian had the bag. She backed toward the door with it, both straps in her hands, and watched the 2 men fight, while her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and the ringing from the gunshot was still occupying the top third of her hearing range, and somewhere downstairs she heard Reyes coming up the stairs fast. Marco was bigger. Luca was more precise. For 12 or 15 seconds, it was genuinely unclear which of those qualities would matter more, and then Marco made the error of reaching for his weapon, and Luca got his forearm across Marco's throat, and the leverage shifted decisively. Reyes came through the door. 3 seconds later, it was over. Marco on the floor, face down, Reyes with a knee in his back and both wrists controlled, breathing hard. All 3 of them breathing hard. The specific post-violence breathing of bodies coming off adrenaline, the hyperventilation-adjacent panting that happened before the nervous system accepted that the immediate danger had passed. Luca stood over Marco with his weapon reholstered, and his hand pressed to his side where Marco had gotten an elbow in during the last seconds of the fight. Not a wound. Bruised ribs at worst. His face had a cut along the jaw from something, a ring probably, that was bleeding in the contained, persistent way that shallow face cuts bleed, more alarming looking than actually dangerous. He looked at Vivian. She held up the bag. He exhaled through his nose. "The recordings are intact?" he said. "I don't know. The safe was open when we came in." His jaw tightened. He looked down at Marco. "Did you copy them?" Marco's face was pressed into the dusty floor. His breathing was controlled now, forced to controlled, the discipline of a man who'd accepted the immediate situation and was recalibrating for whatever came next. "No," he said. "I need to believe that." "I didn't have time. I was still trying to get the second safe open when you came in." A pause. Flat. "The first safe. The ledgers. I photographed them 3 weeks ago." Luca was very still. Vivian felt the floor shift under the weight of that. 3 weeks ago. Before Ortega. Before Kessler. before any of the case architecture they'd built together. The ledgers, the foundational evidence, potentially in Valmont hands for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Luca said. They wanted originals. I couldn't get originals without you knowing. But photographs. Yes. The word sat in the room and did its damage. Luca turned from Marco. He crossed to the window that overlooked the alley and stood with his back to the room and his hand still pressed to his ribs, and looked out at the dark below while the rest of them breathed and waited and said nothing. Vivian watched him. She understood what she was watching. A man recalculating everything from the new foundation of what he now knew, running the revised numbers, determining what remained viable and what had been compromised and what the compromised elements meant for the overall structure. She let him do it. She had her own version running in parallel. 3 weeks. If Valmont had photographs of the ledgers for 3 weeks, he knew what they contained. He knew the names, the account numbers, the transfer documentation. He knew what the ledgers proved, and therefore he knew what they needed to counter it. Additional documentation, supporting witnesses, corroborating records from within the Shell Corporation structure that could muddy the evidentiary water enough to make prosecution complicated. 3 weeks was enough time to do that, but the recordings were different. Audio of Arthur Valmont's voice was not something that could be muddied. It couldn't be recontextualized by counter-documentation. A voice was a voice, especially a senator's voice, distinctive and publicly known, saying specific things in specific language at specific dates and times. That was why Marco had come for them tonight. "We have to move on the timeline," Vivian said. Luca didn't turn from the window. "Ortega is compromised," she continued. "Kessler, we can't reach. The ledger photographs have been in Valmont's hands for 3 weeks. Every day we wait is a day they use to construct a counter-narrative." She paused. "But they don't have the recordings. Not yet." Luca turned. "What are you proposing?" "The Centennial Ball," she said. "Valmont's campaign announcement. 6 days." Reyes looked up from Marco with an expression that said he understood exactly what she was proposing and had opinions about it. "It's too exposed," Reyes said. "It's the only event where Arthur Valmont will be in a controlled public space with cameras rolling and every major political donor in the state watching live." She held Luca's gaze. "You release the recordings at the announcement. You don't give them 6 days to prepare a counter-narrative. You don't give them time to arrange additional documentation to muddy the ledgers. You hit them at the exact moment when the entire city is watching. The security at the ball. I have access," she said. "I was on the Foundation's donor committee until 2 weeks ago. I still have credentials." Luca studied her face. "They'll have updated the access list. Probably. But the ball uses a contracted AV company for broadcast. I know the technical director. We went to school together." She said it simply, not proudly, as a fact that existed in the world and could be used. If the recordings can be patched into the venue's broadcast system, that's a significant if. Yes, it is. She held his look. But it's what we have. The office was very quiet. Marco breathed on the floor. The work lamp threw its hard light against the empty shelving unit and the open safe door and the plaster dust from the gunshot still settling slowly through the air. Luca looked at the bag in her hands for a moment. "I need to hear them," he said. "All of them. Tonight, before I commit to anything." Agreed. They left the office at 1:17 a.m., Reyes managing Marco through the stairwell with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this specific category of task before and found a system that worked. They drove back across the city in the blue SUV with the recordings in the bag on the seat between Vivian and Luca, and the silence running thick and purposeful between all of them. In the apartment above the lake, Luca found a portable audio player in the second drawer of the steel desk. Old, compact, the kind of device that required physical media and produced no digital trail, and they listened to Raymond Mercer's recordings for 4 hours. Raymond Mercer's voice. That was the part Vivian had not prepared for. She'd thought about the recordings abstractly. Evidence, leverage, legal mechanism, and she had not properly imagined that the recordings would contain her father's voice, his living voice recorded in the months before his death, narrating what he'd found and what he suspected and what he feared in the precise, meticulous cadence of a forensic accountant documenting a case. Because that was what he was. Because he'd known that precision was the only protection available to him, and he'd applied it until the end. And then Arthur Valmont's voice. A phone tap, recorded by her father through means she didn't fully understand and didn't need to. 23 minutes of Arthur Valmont in conversation with 3 other people, a federal prosecutor, a state contractor, and a man identified only as the judge, discussing with the comfortable specificity of powerful people who believe themselves unmonitored exactly what they'd done, what they'd paid, and what would happen to anyone who attempted to document it. Raymond Mercer's name appeared in the 23rd minute. "The accountant," the contractor said. "Is that resolved?" "Resolved," Arthur Valmont said. "He'll be discredited before the week's out. Nobody's going to hear a word from Raymond Mercer that matters." But Vivian sat on Luca's sofa and listened to the most powerful man in Illinois order her father's destruction in 12 words, and felt something in her chest complete a circuit that had been open for 3 years. Not healing, nothing as clean as that, but a closing, a finality. The specific sensation of certainty arriving after years of its absence. She knew. Now she had proof that she knew. Luca stopped the recording. The room was silent. He looked at her. She looked at the player in his hand. "That's enough," he said quietly. "There's more." "That's enough," he repeated. Different emphasis. Not cutting her off, offering her a boundary, the room to stop if she needed to stop. She shook her head. "Play the rest." He did. By the time they finished, it was past 5 in the morning, and the lake outside the windows had gone from black to the dark gray that preceded dawn, the water moving in long, slow swells under a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. Luca set the player down. "The prosecutor in the recording," Vivian said. Her voice was flat from 4 hours of controlled listening. "Do you know who he is?" "Yes." "Is he still active?" "He's now deputy district attorney for Cook County." The information settled without surprise. She'd stopped being surprised by the scope of it sometime around hour 2. "If we go to the ball and we do this and it works," she said, "what happens to you?" Luca looked at her. "Complicated things," he said. "More specifically, the case against my organization becomes active again. The federal attention that's been managed and redirected for the past 18 months refocuses." He said it with the matter-of-fact delivery of a man who'd calculated this cost long ago and continued anyway. "There are things I've built that will have to come apart." "You knew that going in." "Yes." "Then why?" "Because your father's name is in that recording, being destroyed by the same people who used my family's infrastructure to destroy him." His voice was level, quiet. "I don't expect you to understand that as sufficient reason, but it's the reason." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She didn't fully understand it. She understood the shape of it, honor, or whatever the functional equivalent was in the moral architecture of a man like Luca DeSantis, the specific code that made certain things unacceptable regardless of personal cost. But the depth of it, the full weight of why he'd spent 2 years building this at considerable risk to himself and his organization for a man he'd never met. She was still working on that part. 6 days, she said. 6 days. She stood up. She was exhausted in a way that had gone past fatigue into something geological, layers of accumulated tiredness pressed under their own weight into something dense and slow. "I need to sleep," she said. "And then I need to find Marcus Webb." "Your AV contact." "Yes. I'll find him for you. I'll find him myself." She said it without aggression, as a parameter, a boundary between what she was willing to receive and what she needed to do on her own terms. Luca nodded once. He understood parameters. She went to the door, stopped. "The cut on your jaw needs to be closed," she said. "You've been ignoring it for 4 hours." He touched it with 2 fingers, looked at the blood on them. "I'm fine." "You're stubborn." "Also that?" The corners of his mouth moved those 2 millimeters again. She left. The 6 days moved the way days move when you're building towards something irreversible, both slower and faster than they should, each hour carrying contradictory weights. Vivian found Marcus Webb on day 2 through channels that required more ingenuity than she'd anticipated, and a conversation that required more honesty than was comfortable. She told him enough. Not everything, not Luca, not the recording's full scope, but enough that Webb, who had his own history with the Valmont Foundation's treatment of contracted workers, sat with it for 20 minutes and then said yes. On day 3, Harrison published the second piece. Worse than the first. More specific. Photographs of Vivian entering and leaving Luca's building. Timestamps. The implication of criminal conspiracy. Of a woman leveraging organized crime connections for personal vendetta. Of Raymond Mercer's daughter using her father's false martyrdom as cover for genuine criminal behavior. Her second employer called and terminated her that afternoon. She read the termination email sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment and felt the mechanism of it, the familiar architecture of systematic destruction, and this time it didn't hollow her out. This time it made her cold and focused and mean in the precise, functional way that grief becomes when it's been weaponized long enough. They were scared. Publishing this piece, escalating this publicly, 6 days before the centennial ball, they were scared. Which meant they knew something was coming, which meant Marco's capture had communicated something back through whatever channel Marco's capture gets communicated through when the people who compromised him realized he hadn't returned. She called Luca. They know we have the recordings. I assumed that by day 2, he said. The ball is going to be locked down tighter than we planned. Yes. Does that change the plan? A pause. Brief. No, he said. It changes the difficulty, not the plan. On day 4, she bought a dress. Not rented. Bought. Spent money she didn't have on a black velvet gown that she paid for with the last of the savings she'd been accumulating for 2 years toward the apartment deposit on a better place to live. She stood in the dressing room of the second-hand boutique on Wabash and looked at herself in the mirror and made a decision about who she was walking into that ballroom as. Not Raymond Mercer's ruined daughter. Not Harrison Valmont's discarded problem. Not a woman in a rented dress standing in a champagne puddle. Someone who had spent 3 years building toward this specific night and was ready to spend whatever was left of herself to finish it. On day 5, Luca came to her apartment. He stood in her doorway. No men with him, no tactical purpose, just himself in a dark coat with the collar up against the cold, and handed her a physical file folder. Read it tonight, he said. She opened it standing at the door. Inside, documentation of Marco's cooperation with Valmont's people. Dates, transfers. The specific amounts paid for specific pieces of information. And at the back, 3 pages of additional recording transcripts, partial, not complete, excerpted by someone with forensic training, documenting 2 conversations between Arthur Valmont and the deputy district attorney about their response to the Mercer case. Material Luca had been holding separately, his own private compartment, the one she hadn't known about. She looked up at him. There's more in there than what I showed you the first night, he said. I can see that. I held it because I wasn't sure it was admissible without the right presentation. Ortega was going to handle that. He paused. Now you'll need to handle it. How? Webb gets the recordings into the broadcast. When the room hears the audio, they'll want documentation, physical documentation, something they can see. You want me to distribute this at the ball? I want you to be ready to distribute it if the moment calls for it. He held her gaze. You'll know the moment. She looked at the folder, at the 3 years of material she'd spent alone in dark rooms trying to assemble from fragments while it existed in its complete form in this man's possession. You could have shown me this weeks ago, she said. Yes. Why didn't you? Because if something went wrong before the ball, I needed you to be able to say honestly that you didn't have it. His voice was level, but she heard the weight behind it. Not apology, but acknowledgement. The recognition that withholding had cost her and had been a choice, and he was owning the choice without performing remorse about it. I was protecting you by keeping you limited. I understand if that's not acceptable. Vivian stood with the folder in her hands and the cold from the hallway coming through the open door and looked at this man who operated in circles and compartments and layers of calculated protection and decided, in the specific way that decisions get made when you're too tired for anything but clarity, that she would finish this first and have all the feelings about his methodology afterward. It's not acceptable, she said. We'll discuss it when this is over. Fair. Don't bring men to the ball. It'll flag the security. Reyes. 1. Reyes. He nodded. She stepped back from the door. He stepped back from the threshold. Get some sleep tonight, he said. You too. She paused. Your jaw healed. You noticed. I noticed things. She closed the door. On day 6, the day of the Centennial Ball, Vivian woke at 4 a.m. and lay in the dark of her studio apartment and listened to the radiator clank and the city move outside and thought about her father. Not the ending. The middle. The Tuesday mornings when he'd make terrible coffee and read the financial papers at the kitchen table and explain things to her, not because she asked, but because he thought everyone should understand how money moved, because money was how power moved, and power was the thing worth understanding if you wanted to know why the world was the way it was. She got up at 5, made coffee, looked at the photo on the shelf. Tonight, she said quietly, to no one, to the photograph, to the specific frequency of air in a room where someone's memory still lives. She put on the black velvet dress at 6. By 8 o'clock that evening, the Blackthorn Grand Hotel blazed against a winter sky that had finally stopped its months of rain and turned clear and hard and cold as cut glass. And Chicago's elite arrived for the Valmont Centennial Ball in a procession of black cars and camera flashes, and the specific gravitational pageantry of power performing itself for an audience it controlled. Vivian Mercer arrived at 8:15 with Marcus Webb's access credential in her bag, a folder of documentation against her side, and the black dress moving around her legs as she walked toward the entrance of the building where 3 weeks earlier she'd stood in rented silver with champagne at her feet. She handed her credential to the scanner at the door. It cleared. She walked in. She found Webb's position in the AV room on sublevel 2 at 8:32. He handed her the wireless transmitter, small, the size of a thumb drive, and they looked at each other for a moment with the look of two people who understand they are past the decision point and into the execution. 9:45, he said. That's when his speech starts. I'll have the feed open. Confirmed. She went back up to the ballroom at 8:40. The room was the same chandeliers, the same orchestra, the same architectural arrogance of a city that had been celebrating its own corruption for long enough that the celebration had become indistinguishable from culture. But the room felt different to her tonight. Not smaller exactly, but more mappable, like a system she understood rather than an environment she endured. She saw Luca at 8:55. He entered through the east corridor, Reyes behind him, and the room adjusted to his presence the way it always did, that pressure wave of awareness moving outward from him, through the crowd. He wore black tonight. His jaw was healed clean. His eyes found her across 200 feet of ballroom floor with the directness of a man who'd noted her position the moment he entered and was simply acknowledging the acknowledgement. She gave him nothing visible, a slight adjustment of her posture, a fraction of a degree. He understood. Harrison found her at 9:10. She saw him coming and didn't move, stood her ground at the edge of the floor with a glass of water, not champagne, water, a decision she'd made consciously, and let him arrive. He looked at the dress first. She saw his eyes do it, the involuntary assessment, the 3-year reflex of evaluating her as an extension of his own world, and then his face reset to controlled fury. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "My credential cleared. I'll have you removed. Try." He stepped close. The same proximity as before, the deliberate spatial invasion of a man who used physical closeness as a tool. "You have no idea what tonight is," he said. "What's about to happen? What my father is announcing." "I know exactly what your father is announcing." "Then you know it's over. Whatever you and DeSantis have been building, it's over. We've already neutralized the legal channels. Your federal contacts are compromised. Your documentation has been countered." His voice was low, certain, the voice of a man delivering genuinely believed intelligence. "You've got nothing." Vivian looked at him. She thought about her father's voice on a portable audio player. 23 minutes. The word resolve delivered with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been wrong about these things. "Okay," she said. Harrison blinked. He'd expected different. He'd expected fight or fear and got neither, and the absence of both threw him just slightly off his calibration. "Okay?" he repeated. "I heard you." He studied her face for the tell, the micro-expression that would reveal the bluff, the fear underneath, the performance of composure cracking at its edges. He found nothing. Because it wasn't a bluff. At 9:43 p.m., Senator Arthur Valmont took the stage at the Valmont Centennial Ball to announce his presidential campaign before 1,400 guests and a live broadcast feed that ran to every major news outlet in the country. He was confident. He was prepared. He was everything that 40 years of successfully escaping consequences had made him. Comfortable in the certainty that the ground he stood on was solid, that the infrastructure he'd built was holding, that the woman in the black dress somewhere in the crowd behind him was a minor irritant who had been adequately managed. At 9:46, he said the word freedom. At 9:47, every screen in the ballroom went black. Then Raymond Mercer's recording began to play. Arthur Valmont's voice filled the ballroom, filled it completely, occupied every cubic foot of air from the orchestra floor to the chandeliers, saying things in the comfortable specificity of a man who had never once believed he would be heard saying them. The room froze, not the gradual quiet of social adjustment, the instantaneous total cessation of a ballroom that had just had the floor removed from beneath it. Harrison turned toward Vivian. She was already moving, not away, toward the center of the room, folder in hand, pages separating in her fingers as she moved through the frozen crowd, placing documentation in hands that reached for it with the automatic reflex of people who needed something physical to hold while the world they'd been living in was disassembled in real time above their heads. Arthur Valmont's face drained of color on the stage. Federal agents appeared at every entrance simultaneously. And in the ballroom of the Blackthorn Grand Hotel on a clear December night, the architecture that had been built to destroy Raymond Mercer began piece by piece to. The recording played for 23 minutes. Nobody moved for most of it. Not the guests. Not the federal agents holding positions at every exit. Not the camera operators whose broadcast feed was still running, still live, still transmitting to every news desk that had tuned in for a presidential announcement and was now receiving something categorically different. They held their shots on autopilot, the professional reflex of people who understood that whatever was happening in front of their lenses was the kind of footage that got replayed for decades. Arthur Valmont stood on the stage for the first 4 minutes. Vivian watched him from the floor, moving slowly through the frozen crowd, distributing pages from the folder to hands that took them without looking at her. Guests reading documentation while the senator's own voice cataloged his crimes above their heads. The surreal doubling of a man being dismantled in real time by his own words, while his body remained upright on a stage he'd built over 40 years. Then Arthur Valmont did something she hadn't anticipated. He walked off the stage. Not running, not collapsing, walking. With the deliberate, measured pace of a man who had decided that if this was the end, he would conduct himself through it with the posture he'd maintained for 4 decades, because posture was the last thing left when everything else had been stripped away, and Arthur Valmont was not a man who knew how to exist without it. He stepped down from the stage and moved toward the east corridor, and the federal agents moved to intercept, and the crowd parted around all of it with the stunned, slow fluidity of people in a dream where the rules of physics have been quietly renegotiated. 2 agents reached him at the corridor entrance. He stopped. He didn't resist. He stood very still while one of the agents spoke to him. Formal words, official language, the procedural machinery of accountability engaging for the first time in 4 decades. And his face went through something that Vivian, watching from 30 feet away, could only describe as relief. The specific, exhausted relief of a man who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been told he could put it down, regardless of what happened next. Then the gunshot, different from the one in her father's office. That one had been contained, directional, plaster, and panic. This one came from the east corridor, from the direction Arthur Valmont had been walking toward, and it was followed immediately by shouting, not the ballroom social shouting, the operational kind, voices giving orders and responding to orders. And the crowd stopped being frozen and became something much more dangerous. 1,400 people in a confined space, understanding simultaneously that something had changed and trying to find the exits. Vivian was already moving before she understood why. Her body knew before her mind caught up, the way bodies know things when survival and 3 weeks of operating in the same space as professional danger have recalibrated the instincts. She moved against the crowd, toward the east corridor, pushing through shoulders and elbows and the perfume and the panic of people who had come tonight to watch power celebrate itself and were now discovering what power looked like when the celebration ended. She found Reyes at the corridor entrance. Blood on his sleeve. Not his, the angle was wrong, the spray pattern inconsistent with a wound he was holding. His eyes tracked to her the moment she appeared, and in them she read the specific information of a man communicating with his face because his hands were occupied and his voice was needed elsewhere. "Luca," she said. Reyes tilted his head left. Down the corridor she went. The corridor was marble-floored and chandeliered and designed for the graceful transit of important people between important rooms, and tonight it had been repurposed into a different kind of space, the aftermath space, the space that exists immediately after something irreversible has happened and the world is sorting out what it means. Arthur Valmont was on the floor, seated, not fallen, his back against the wall, both legs straight in front of him, his tuxedo jacket open. 2 federal agents crouched beside him, one on a radio. He was conscious. His face was gray and his breathing was shallow, but his eyes were open, tracking, maintaining that final posture of awareness even now. She didn't stop for him. She found Luca 12 feet further down the corridor. He was upright, standing with one hand against the marble wall, the other pressed to his left shoulder, and the dark fabric of his jacket was darker at the shoulder in the specific way fabric gets when it's absorbing something. His face was composed, that infuriating, controlled composition, but underneath it she could see the physical cost, the effort of maintaining it, the jaw set slightly harder than its resting position, and the breathing more deliberate than usual. "You're shot," she said. It grazed, "You're shot." She crossed to him and pulled his hand away from the shoulder and looked at what was underneath it. Through the jacket, through the shirt, a wound that was emphatically not a graze, deep enough that the bleeding was serious and steady and would not resolve itself through the application of pressure and denial. "Sit down." "I'm fine." "Luca." She said it the same way she'd said it in the apartment the night they'd learned the architecture was compromised, with the specific weight that made him look at her directly, fully, the way he looked at things he'd decided to take seriously. "Sit down." He sat down, slowly, using the wall as a guide, lowering himself to the marble floor with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain he wasn't going to acknowledge verbally. She crouched in front of him and used both hands to apply pressure to the wound through his jacket. He didn't make a sound. His breathing adjusted, slower, more controlled, which she understood was his version of the same thing. "Who fired?" she said. "Connors." His voice was level. "One of my captains. He was in the corridor, I don't know how long. Positioned before the ball started." A pause. One controlled breath. "He was shooting at you." The words landed differently than they should have. She'd processed a significant amount of new information in the past 3 hours, and her capacity for shock had been substantially reduced. But this... "He was positioned to hit you when the recording started," Luca continued. "When the crowd moved, the angle changed. I was between him and... You stepped between us. The geometry worked out. That's not..." She stopped, pressed harder on the wound. He didn't flinch. "That is not what happened, and you know it." He looked at her. From the floor, looking up at her crouched above him, with Chicago's winter pressing against every window in the building and his blood warm between her fingers, and 1,400 people in various stages of panic on the other side of the corridor wall. "Connors?" she said carefully. "He was working with Valmont. He had his own arrangement." Luca's voice was still measured, still that controlled flat effect, but she could hear the edges of it now, the effort it cost, which she'd learned to read as the equivalent of another man shouting. "Independent of Marco. I didn't know. I should have known." "Where's he now?" "Federal custody. Reyes." She nodded. She kept the pressure on the wound and looked at his face and thought about what he'd just told her. that the bullet had been intended for her, that he'd moved, that the geometry had worked out, and felt something in her chest that was too complicated and too large and too poorly timed to look at directly. She filed it. Same place she kept the other things that needed processing. "The agents have Arthur," she said. "I saw. He's wounded." Connor shot wide. It was panic fire, not precision. He paused. "Arthur will survive to stand trial, which is the worst fate for him. He knows that." Federal medics appeared at the corridor entrance. She heard them before she saw them, the equipment sound and the professional voice cadence, and she waved them forward with one blood-covered hand without releasing pressure on Luca's shoulder until a medic was in position to replace her. She stood up. Her hands were dark with his blood. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked down the corridor to where Arthur Valmont was being attended to, and beyond that to the ballroom where the recording had long since ended, and the room was being managed by federal agents, and the cameras were still rolling, and the story was already disassembling itself into the various narratives that would occupy the city for months. She walked back toward the ballroom. Harrison found her at the entrance, or rather, she found him. He was standing 20 feet inside the ballroom doorway with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. Not the composed stillness of his father, nothing inherited or practiced, but the raw, unformed stillness of a 32-year-old who had spent his entire life inside a structure that has just collapsed and doesn't yet understand what he is without it. He looked at her hands. He knew whose blood that was and what it meant, and she could see him calculating whether it changed anything, whether Luca being wounded was leverage, whether the night's chaos created some window, some surviving angle, and she watched him run through the calculation and arrive at the answer and watched the answer register on his face. Nothing. There was no surviving angle. "Harrison," she said. He looked at her face, not at the dress, not at the folder still tucked under her arm, not at the room behind her or the agents moving through it, at her face. The way a person looks at something when they've finally stopped calculating and there's nothing left but the person in front of them. "I loved you," he said. The words came out scraped and unpolished, nothing performed about them. I know it doesn't matter now, but I did. Before all of this, whatever I became, I wasn't always—" "I know," she said. It stopped him. "I know you weren't always," she said. "That's the worst part." She looked at him steadily. Not with anger anymore. The anger had been burning for 3 years and had finally found its proper material and consumed itself tonight, leaving behind something quieter and more permanent. "You had a choice, multiple choices. You made them." His jaw worked. The movie star face was still there underneath everything. The jaw, the bone structure, the raw physical architecture of a man built to inhabit spaces like this. But the life animating it had gone somewhere else, and what remained was just structure without heat. "What happens now?" he asked. She thought about the answer, not tactically, actually. "You answer for what you did," she said, specifically and completely. Every choice, every decision, every time you had the option to be different and chose not to be. She paused. "That's what happens now." An agent appeared at Harrison's shoulder. Harrison looked at her for one more second. Then he looked away. And in the looking away and the specific quality of how he moved his eyes from her face, she understood that whatever Harrison Valmont became after tonight, the version of him that had stood in this room 3 weeks earlier and poured champagne at her feet, was already gone. Not redeemed? Nothing so clean as that, but finished. Concluded. She turned and walked away from him. She didn't look back. The weeks that followed were the longest short weeks of Vivian's life. She gave 12 hours of testimony over 3 days to federal investigators who had, by the morning after the ball, assembled the full picture of what the recordings and the documentation and the collapsed cooperation of Arthur Valmont's associates in the hours after his arrest had provided. She sat in rooms with federal seals on the walls and overhead lighting that made everyone look like suspects and answered questions with the precise, specific, unhurried accuracy her father had taught her. Don't elaborate, don't interpret, state what you know and distinguish it clearly from what you believe. And she did it until the rooms were satisfied. Kessler resurfaced on day 4. He hadn't been compromised. He'd gone underground at his own initiative when Ortega's phone went dark, a self-protective measure that proved correct, and which Vivian had mixed feelings about that she kept to herself. His documentation survived intact and was entered into evidence with the recordings. Ortega had been detained briefly and released when the scope of the case made it clear that his involvement had been legitimate. He'd been compromised from within, not working against the investigation. He spent 3 days in federal debriefing and emerged looking 10 years older, but legally clear. Marco cooperated. This was the development that surprised her least when she thought about it later. The same calculation that had made him a liability had always contained the possibility of switching direction when the direction changed, and with Valmont's infrastructure collapsing in real time, cooperation was simply the new mathematics. He entered a federal arrangement and became the kind of testimony that sealed cases and ended careers and put men in rooms where the windows had no handles. The deputy district attorney resigned on day 6. The federal prosecutor named in the recordings was suspended pending investigation. 3 state officials whose names appeared in the documentation announced their retirements within the same 48-hour window, the coordinated timing of people who'd been advised by the same lawyer. Arthur Valmont was charged on 11 federal counts. His lawyers were excellent, and the process would be long and expensive and fought at every procedural inch. But the recordings were unambiguous and the documentation was thorough, and Arthur Valmont was 71 years old, and the federal system, when it finally turned its attention fully toward a man, had more time than the man did. Harrison was charged separately. The charges against him were narrower but substantive: conspiracy, financial fraud, obstruction. The kind of charges that stripped a man of the specific thing he valued most: the ability to inhabit rooms where power lived and move through them as if he belonged. He would never inhabit those rooms again. Vivian knew this with certainty and felt, when she knew it, less than she expected to. Not satisfaction, she'd thought it would feel like satisfaction, had anticipated that specific emotion for 3 years, but something more neutral and more tired. The feeling of a task completed rather than a wrong righted, because some wrongs were too fundamental to be righted, could only be documented and answered for, the damage already done and permanent regardless of what the courts concluded. Her father was still dead. That didn't change. She understood finally that it never would, and that the thing she'd spent 3 years calling justice was actually closer to record, the establishment of accurate record, the insistence that the truth of what happened be visible in the permanent documentation of the world, that Raymond Mercer's name be attached to the truth of what he was rather than the lie of what they'd made him. 3 weeks after the ball, Vivian went to the Federal Records Office and filed the formal request to have her father's posthumous case review completed. The process took 11 more days. On a Tuesday afternoon in January, a letter arrived at her studio apartment with an official seal in language she read 3 times to be certain she was reading correctly. The charges against Raymond Mercer, forensic accountant, were formally vacated. She sat at her kitchen table and held the letter and didn't cry. She'd expected to cry, had been braced for it, prepared, but what came instead of tears was the breathing. The slow, deep, involuntary breathing of a body releasing something it had been holding at tension for so long that it had stopped noticing the tension, only now feeling the release. She sat and breathed for 20 minutes. Then she put the letter in a clean envelope and went to the shelf by the window and propped it against the frame of her father's photograph, where he was squinting into a summer sun with his hand raised and his rumpled blazer open and his whole face arranged in the unselfconscious expression of a man who didn't know he was being recorded. "There," she said quietly. "There it is." Oh, Luca came through surgery without complication, which the surgeon described as fortunate, given the wound's depth and Luca's apparent decision to delay treatment while seated on a marble corridor floor having a conversation. A decision the surgeon characterized as medically inadvisable in language that Vivian suspected was considerably more colorful in the operating room. She visited him on the 2nd day. The private room, the most private the hospital offered, a fact that required no explanation given who the patient was smaller than his apartment and larger than her studio and contained exactly 1 chair pulled to the bedside by someone who had anticipated a visitor and positioned it accordingly. He was sitting up. His left arm was in a sling, and he was reading from a tablet with his right hand, and he looked, she thought, more tired than she'd ever seen him. Not the controlled fatigue of operational pressure, but the genuine exhaustion of a body that had spent 2 years in one bullet and several complicated weeks and was now being instructed by medical authority to stop and repair itself. He set the tablet down when she came in. She sat in the positioned chair. They looked at each other for a moment. "The letter came," she said. He understood which letter. "I know. Ortega called me." "Did you have anything to do with the speed of the review?" He met her eyes steadily. "I made one call." She considered this, the old version of herself. The version that had walked into his apartment 3 weeks ago with keys in her shaking hand and 3 years of wariness packed tight between her ribs, would have wanted to argue about the line between help and interference, between support and the subtle manipulation of outcomes by men who understood that their calls carried weight that other people's calls didn't. The current version of herself understood that some help was simply help, and that the lines she'd drawn in her own head at the beginning of this had been the necessary lines of a woman protecting herself in a situation she didn't yet fully understand, and that the situation had been sufficiently understood now to permit some revision. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. The room was quiet in the specific way hospital rooms are quiet, a constructed quiet, the mechanical silence of a space designed to allow bodies to do the work of healing without the interference of the world's ordinary noise. "What happens to your organization?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "It's already happening." He said it without apparent distress, the flat effect of a man who'd made decisions at significant personal cost, and had finished grieving the cost before she'd arrived. "The federal attention is active. Several operations that were," he paused, selecting language, "that existed in gray spaces are being closed. Contracts that existed because of relationships that are no longer viable are ending. People who worked for you. People who worked for me are making their own arrangements. Most of them have options. I've made certain they have options. How much of what you built survives?" He looked at the window. Outside, January had made Chicago into a gray and white geometry of cold buildings and cold sky, and the specific cheerless beauty of a Midwestern city in deep winter. "The legitimate businesses," he said, "the hotel, the property holdings, the import operation that was always actually an import operation." He turned back from the window. "Enough to build something different from, if that's what I choose." "Is it?" "I'm considering it." He held her gaze. "There are factors I'm still evaluating." She understood she was one of the factors. She didn't say so. He didn't say so. Some things didn't require saying, existed in the room as established facts that both people acknowledged silently and moved around with the care that new, fragile, significant things required. "Marco," she said, "how do you feel about it?" A long pause, longer than his usual pauses. "Betrayal by someone you trusted for 20 years doesn't resolve cleanly," he said finally. "It just—" He stopped. Tried again. "You carry the version of the person you trusted alongside the truth of who they were, and neither cancels the other. They just both exist." Vivian thought about Harrison saying, "I loved you," in a voice scraped down to something real. "Yes," she said. "That's right." They sat with that for a moment. The window light moved slightly as clouds passed over it, and the room changed shade by a few degrees and changed back. "Connors," she said. She'd been working toward this one carefully, leaving it for the right positioning in the conversation, because it carried more weight than the others. Luca's jaw set fractionally. "I didn't see it," he said. 22 years. Connors has been in my organization since I was 26 years old. He was my father's man before he was mine." He said it with the specific quality of a man making himself say a true thing that cost something. "I ran the analysis afterward. The signs were there. The behavioral shifts, the financial patterns, the loyalty that had slowly reoriented. I missed them. I was looking at Marco. I wasn't looking at Connors because Connors was—" He stopped again. "Because he was the one you least suspected." "Yes." "Which is exactly why Valmont chose him." "Yes." She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, and looked at him. This man who operated in layers and compartments and calculated every available variable with a precision she found both admirable and occasionally maddening, who had nevertheless missed the thing that nearly killed her, and who was sitting in a hospital bed with a gunshot wound that had resulted directly from his missing it. "You can't see everything," she said. He looked at her. "You're not built for it," she continued. "Nobody is. You can be the most patient, most precise, most careful person in every room you walk into, and you will still miss the Connors in the room because some things only become visible in retrospect, and retrospect is the one angle you can never operate from in advance." Luca was quiet. "I know you know this," she said. "I'm saying it out loud because I need to hear myself say it too." He understood. "Connors was aiming at you." "I know." "If I hadn't, I know." She held his gaze. "I know what you did. I'm not going to perform not knowing it." She breathed once. "And I'm not going to pretend that it was just geometry." The quietest possible smile. Both corners of his mouth this time, the full 2 millimeters on each side. "It was partially geometry," he said, "partially. The rest—" He stopped. Let the sentence stay unfinished, which, from Luca DeSantis, was the equivalent of a complete paragraph. She sat back in the chair. Outside the window, a gust of wind moved through the buildings, and the bare winter trees between them bent slightly and recovered. "My father trusted the wrong person," she said. "Made one call that ended everything." "Yes." "And I walked into a car with a man I didn't know and made a different kind of trust in it." She stopped. Looked at her hands, which were clean now, had been clean for weeks, nothing under the nails and no blood on the knuckles, and the only evidence of the past 3 weeks written in the parts of her that weren't visible from the outside. "It cost things. It cost things I didn't expect to spend." "What things?" "The version of myself that only trusted documentation." She looked up. "The version that kept everything at the distance where it couldn't hurt me." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. The cataloging stillness that she'd learned over weeks of close proximity was not coldness, but the opposite. The specific attentiveness of a man who listened with everything he had and gave back only what was genuinely considered. "That version was lonely," he said. "Yes," she said. She was. She stood up. Not because the conversation was over. It wasn't, not entirely. There were rooms of it still unexplored, and she understood that. But because some conversations needed to be stood up from, needed to be left with something unresolved so they could continue in the space between people, rather than only in the rooms where they were seated face to face. "When you're out of here," she said, 2 more days. "When you're out, come to my apartment for coffee." She said it simply. Not for strategy, not for documentation, for coffee. He looked at her. "My coffee is terrible," she said. "Fair warning. I'll survive it." She almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles were still learning how to do it without the 3 years of guard behind them, but the shape of it was there, the beginning of the shape. She left. The walk from the hospital to the L station took 12 minutes through January cold that came off the lake sideways and hit the exposed skin of her face and neck with the cheerful indifference of weather that didn't know or care what the person walking through it had recently survived. She kept her hands in her coat pockets and her head slightly down and moved through the city at her own pace, not hurrying, not running from anything, not navigating toward any tactical destination. Just walking. Chicago moved around her the way cities move around the people who have lived inside them long enough to stop being tourists in their own lives. Cabs, delivery trucks, pigeons doing their municipal business on the sidewalk edge. The smell of coffee from a corner shop, and under it, the lake smell, always the lake smell, the cold mineral breath of something large and old and indifferent to human drama. She thought about her father walking these same streets. Not in the final year, not the man reduced and terrified and alone in his rented room, but in the years before. The years of Tuesday mornings and terrible coffee and balance sheets spread across the kitchen table and the patient, precise voice explaining how money moved and power moved and why understanding those movements was the most honest form of education available. He had been trying to protect her. She understood that now, with a completeness she hadn't had before, not just as intellectual knowledge, but as felt truth, the kind that settles in the body rather than the brain. He'd been teaching her to see the same things he saw because he understood, at some level he never fully articulated, that the world he'd chosen to examine honestly was a world that pushed back against examination, and he wanted her equipped. He'd done the job. Imperfectly, the way all jobs of genuine love are done, with gaps and omissions and the unavoidable limitation of not knowing what specifically she'd need, which meant teaching her everything and hoping the relevant pieces would surface at the right moments. They had. She came up from the L station at her stop and walked the 4 blocks to her building and climbed the stairs and unlocked her door and went inside. The radiator was working. The apartment was warm. Her father's photograph stood on the shelf with the vacated charges letter propped against its frame, and the late afternoon light came through the single west-facing window at the specific angle that made the space feel, briefly, larger than it was. She made coffee. It was terrible. She'd known this about herself for years and continued to make it anyway, which was perhaps a metaphor for something and perhaps wasn't. She stood at the window with the cup and looked out at the Chicago rooftops and the sliver of lake visible between buildings, gray and immense, and carrying its winter light the way it carried everything, without drama, without ceremony, simply present and continuous, and larger than any single story happening at its edge. 2 months later, Vivian Mercer accepted a position with a federal financial crimes unit. Not as an agent, for which she had neither the training nor the inclination, but as a consulting analyst, the specific role that her father's particular education had prepared her for, without either of them knowing that was what the preparation was for. She took the case files with her on her first day. Her own files, the ones she'd built alone in the years before the Gala, the careful, obsessive, incomplete picture she'd assembled from nothing. She kept them not as operational documents, but as the record of what it looked like when one person decided that the truth was worth finding, regardless of what it cost to find it. The cost had been significant. She tallied it honestly in the quiet moments. Her father was still gone. Her reputation had been dragged through every available channel. She'd spent 3 weeks in the orbit of genuine danger. She'd lost 2 jobs and a security deposit and something she was still defining about the version of herself that had walked into this. But she'd also found things she hadn't started out looking for. The name of the wrong person her father had called. The name was a federal official who had since been indicted, whose cooperation was being negotiated, whose culpability extended into corners of the Valmont case that were still being excavated. She'd handed it to Ortega on the same day she filed her consulting paperwork. She'd said nothing ceremonial about it, just handed it over and moved forward. Forward was the only direction that made sense now. Luca came for coffee on the 3rd day after his discharge. He stood in her studio apartment in a dark coat with his left arm still slightly guarded from the healing shoulder, and she handed him a cup and watched him take the first sip, and watched his face manage the response to her genuinely terrible coffee with the same controlled composure he applied to everything, which made her laugh. Actually laugh, the first laugh in weeks that didn't have any performance in it. He looked at her when she laughed, not with surprise. He was past surprise with her by now, but with something that had been building for months and was finally, in this small, warm apartment on a gray January morning, allowed to be visible without the operational context that had required everything to serve a purpose. He set the cup down on her kitchen table. "The coffee is exactly as bad as you said," he told her. "I warned you." "You did." She looked at him. He looked at her. The photo of her father was on the shelf with the letter still propped against it. The radiator knocked twice in its companionable way. Outside the window, Chicago was being Chicago, loud and cold and relentless and unbeautiful in all the ways that made it beautiful. "The hotel on Wacker," she said, "the one you're converting to legitimate operation." "Yes." "You need a forensic auditor." He was quiet for a moment. "I know someone," he said. "So do I," she said. "Me." He looked at her steadily. "That would mean working in the same orbit, yes." She held his gaze. "I'm aware of what it means. I'm proposing it anyway. The federal position is 3 days a week. I have the remaining time." He was quiet in a different way now. The processing quiet. Not hesitation. The genuine consideration of a man who took other people's choices seriously and would not pretend otherwise by rushing past them. "It would be complicated," he said. Most things worth doing are, she said. She walked to the shelf by the window, stood in front of her father's photograph for a moment, the summer squint, the rumpled blazer, the hand raised against the light. Then she turned back toward the room, toward the man standing in it, toward the gray winter morning pressing against the glass, toward the city that had taken from her and given back and remained, as cities do, entirely indifferent to the significance of any of it. She picked up her own cup of terrible coffee. "So," she said, "tell me about the audit trail on Walker." Luca DeSantis, the most feared man in Chicago, reached for the worst cup of coffee he'd ever been offered. And something in the set of his shoulders, in the way he leaned his undamaged arm against her kitchen counter and looked at her with eyes that had finally arrived somewhere they'd been navigating toward for months, changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would show on the kind of footage that got played for decades. Just in the way that real things change, quietly, permanently, in the direction of something neither of them had planned for, and both of them recognized when it arrived. The city moved below the window. The lake held its winter light. And in a studio apartment in Chicago, two people who had each survived the particular violence of losing everything they'd built their lives on stood in the warm, ordinary air of a January morning and began, without ceremony, to build something else.